This is section 51 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 51. December 18 found Washington Hawkins and Colonel Sellers once more at the capital of the nation, standing guard over the university bill. The former gentleman was despondent, the latter hopeful. Washington's distress of mind was chiefly on Laura's account. The court would soon sit to try her case, he said, and consequently a great deal of ready money would be needed in the engineering of it. The university was sure to pass this time, and that would make money plenty, but might not the help come too late? Congress had only just assembled, and delays were to be feared.
"Well," said the colonel, "I don't know, but you are more or less right there. Now let's figure up a little on the preliminaries. I think Congress always tries to do as near right as it can, according to its lights. A man can't ask any fairer than that. The first preliminary it always starts out on is to clean itself, so to speak. It will arraign 2 or 3 dozen of its members, or maybe 4 or 5 dozen, for taking bribes to vote for this and that and the other bill last winter."
It goes up into the dozens, does it?
"Well, yes. In a free country like ours, where any man can run for Congress and anybody can vote for him, you can't expect immortal purity all the time. It ain't in nature. 60 or 80 or 150 people are bound to get in who are not angels in disguise, as young Hicks, the correspondent, says. But still it is a very good average, very good indeed. As long as it averages as well as that, I think we can feel very well satisfied. Even in these days, when people growl so much, and the newspapers are so out of patience, there is still a very respectable minority of honest men in Congress."
"Why, a respectable minority of honest men can't do any good, Colonel."
"Oh, yes, it can, too."
"Why, how?"
"Oh, in many ways, many ways."
"But what are the ways?"
"Well, I don't know. It is a question that requires time. A body can't answer every question right offhand. But it does do good. I am satisfied of that."
"All right, then. Grant that it does good. Go on with the preliminaries."
"Well, that is what I am coming to. First, as I said, they will try a lot of members for taking money for votes. That will take 4 weeks."
"Yes, that's like last year, and it is a sheer waste of the time for which the nation pays those men to work. That is what that is. And it pinches when a body's got a bill waiting."
"A waste of time to purify the fountain of public law? Well, I never heard anybody express an idea like that before. But if it were, it would still be the fault of the minority, for the majority don't institute these proceedings. There is where that minority becomes an obstruction.
But still one can't say it is on the wrong side. Well, after they have finished the bribery cases, they will take up cases of members who have bought their seats with money. That will take another 4 weeks." "Very good. Go on. You have accounted for 2/3 of the session."
"Next they will try each other for various smaller irregularities, like the sale of appointments to West Point cadetships, and that sort of thing, mere trifling pocket-money enterprises that might better be passed over in silence, perhaps, but then one of our Congresses can never rest easy till it has thoroughly purified itself of all blemishes, and that is a thing to be applauded."
"How long does it take to disinfect itself of these minor impurities?"
"Well, about 2 weeks, generally."
"So Congress always lies helpless in quarantine 10 weeks of a session. That's encouraging. Colonel, poor Laura will never get any benefit from our bill. Her trial will be over before Congress has half purified itself. And doesn't it occur to you that by the time it has expelled all its pure members, there may not be enough members left to do business legally?"
"Why, I did not say Congress would expel anybody."
"Well, won't it expel anybody?"
"Not necessarily. Did it last year? It never does. That would not be regular."
"Then why waste all the session in that tomfoolery of trying members?"
"But it is usual. It is customary. The country requires it."
"Then the country is a fool, I think."
"Oh, no. The country thinks somebody is going to be expelled."
"Well, when nobody is expelled, what does the country think then?"
By that time the thing has strung out so long that the country is sick and tired of it, and glad to have a change on any terms. But all that inquiry is not lost. It has a good moral effect.
Who does it have a good moral effect on?
Well, I don't know. On foreign countries, I think. We have always been under the gaze of foreign countries. There is no country in the world, sir, that pursues corruption as inveterably as we do. There is no country in the world whose representatives try each other as much as ours do, or stick to it as long on a stretch. I think there is something great in being a model for the whole civilized world, Washington.
You don't mean a model, you mean an example.
Well, it's all the same. It's just the same thing. It shows that a man can't be corrupt in this country without sweating for it, I can tell you that.
Hang it, Colonel, you just said we never punish anybody for villainous practices.
But, good God, we try them, don't we? Is it nothing to show a disposition to sift things and bring people to a strict account? I tell you it has its effect.
Oh, bother the effect. What is it they do? How do they proceed? You know perfectly well, and it is all bosh, too. Come now, how do they proceed?
Why, they proceed right and regular, and it ain't bosh, Washington, it ain't bosh. They appoint a committee to investigate, and that committee hears evidence 3 weeks, and all the witnesses on one side swear that the accused took money or stock or something for his vote, and then the accused stands up and testifies that he may have done it, but he was receiving and handling a good deal of money at the time, and he doesn't remember this particular circumstance, at least with sufficient distinctness to enable him to grasp it tangibly. So, of course, the thing is not proven, and that is what they say in the verdict. They don't acquit, they don't condemn, they just say, "Charge not proven." It leaves the accused in a kind of a shaky condition before the country. It purifies Congress, it satisfies everybody, and it doesn't seriously hurt anybody. It has taken a long time to perfect our system, but it is the most admirable in the world now.
So one of those long, stupid investigations always turns out in that lame, silly way. Yes, you are correct. I thought maybe you viewed the matter differently from other people. Do you think a Congress of ours could convict the devil of anything if he were a member?
My dear boy, don't let these damaging delays prejudice you against Congress. Don't use such strong language. You talk like a newspaper. Congress has inflicted frightful punishments on its members. Now you know that. When they tried Mr. Fair Oaks, and a cloud of witnesses proved him to be, well, you know what they proved him to be, and his own testimony and his own confessions gave him the same character, what did Congress do then? Come.
Well, what did Congress do?
Well, you know what Congress did, Washington. Congress intimated plainly enough that they considered him almost a stain upon their body, and without waiting 10 days, hardly, to think the thing over, they rose up and hurled at him a resolution declaring that they disapproved of his conduct. Now you know that, Washington.
It was a terrific thing, there is no denying that. If he had been proven guilty of theft, arson, licentiousness, infanticide, and defiling graves, I believe they would have suspended him for 2 days.
You can depend on it, Washington. Congress is vindictive. Congress is savage, sir, when it gets waked up once. It will go to any length to vindicate its honor at such a time.
Ah, well, we have talked the morning through, just as usual in these tiresome days of waiting, and we have reached the same old result. That is to say, we are no better off than when we began. The land bill is just as far away as ever, and the trial is closer at hand. Let's give up everything and die.
Die and leave the Duchess to fight it out all alone? No, no, that won't do. Come now, don't talk so. It is all going to come out right. Now you'll see.
It never will, Colonel, never in the world. Something tells me that. I get more tired and more despondent every day. I don't see any hope. Life is only just a trouble. I am so miserable these days. The Colonel made Washington get up and walk the floor with him, arm in arm. The good old speculator wanted to comfort him, but he hardly knew how to go about it. He made many attempts, but they were lame. They lacked spirit. The words were encouraging, but they were only words. He could not get any heart into them. He could not always warm up now with the old Hawkeye fervor. By and by his lips trembled and his voice got unsteady, and he said,
"Don't give up the ship, my boy. Don't do it. The wind's bound to fetch around and set in our favor, I know it."
And the prospect was so cheerful that he wept. Then he blew a trumpet blast that started the meshes of his handkerchief, and said in almost his breezy old-time way,
"Lord bless us, this is all nonsense. Night doesn't last always. Day has got to break some time or other. Every silver lining has a cloud behind it, as the poet says, and that remark has always cheered me, though I never could see any meaning to it. Everybody uses it, though, and everybody gets comfort out of it. I wish they would start something fresh. Come now, let's cheer up. There's been as good fish in the sea as there are now. It shall never be said that Beriah Sellers— Come in."
It was the telegraph boy. The colonel reached for the message and devoured its contents.
"I said it! Never give up the ship! The trial's postponed till February, and we'll save the child yet. Bless my life, what lawyers they have in New York! Give them money to fight with, and the ghost of an excuse, and they would manage to postpone anything in this world, unless it might be the millennium or something like that. Now for work again, my boy. The trial will last to the middle of March, sure. Congress ends the 4th of March. Within 3 days of the end of the session they will be done putting through the preliminaries, then they will be ready for national business. Our bill will go through in 48 hours, then, and we'll telegraph $1,000,000 to the jury, to the lawyers, I mean, and the verdict of the jury will be accidental murder resulting from justifiable insanity, or something to that effect, Everything is dead sure now. Come, what is the matter? What are you wilting down like that for? You mustn't be a girl, you know."
"Oh, Colonel, I am become so used to troubles, so used to failures, disappointments, hard luck of all kinds, that a little good news breaks me right down. Everything has been so hopeless that now I can't stand good news at all. It is too good to be true, anyway. Don't you see how our bad luck has worked on me? My hair is getting gray, and many nights I don't sleep at all. I wish it was all over and we could rest. I wish we could lie down and just forget everything and let it all be just a dream that is done and can't come back to trouble us any more. I am so tired."
"Ah, poor child, don't talk like that. Cheer up. There's daylight ahead. Don't give up. You'll have Laura again, and Louise, and your mother, and oceans of money. And then you can go away, ever so far away somewhere, if you want to, and forget all about this infernal place. And by George, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. Now, there's my word on it. Cheer up. I'll run out and tell the friends the news."
And he wrung Washington's hand and was about to hurry away when his companion, in a burst of grateful admiration, said,
"I think you are the best soul and the noblest I ever knew, Colonel Sellers. And if the people only knew you as I do, you would not be tagging around here a nameless man. You would be in Congress."
The gladness died out of the colonel's face, and he laid his hand upon Washington's shoulder and said gravely,
"I have always been a friend of your family, Washington, and I think I have always tried to do right as between man and man, according to my lights. Now, I don't think there has ever been anything in my conduct that should make you feel justified in saying a thing like that."
He turned then and walked slowly out, leaving Washington abashed and somewhat bewildered. When Washington had presently got his thoughts into line again, he said to himself, "Why, honestly, I only meant to compliment him. Indeed, I would not have hurt him for the world." End of chapter 51. This is section 52 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 52. The weeks drifted by monotonously enough now. The preliminaries continued to drag along in Congress, and life was a dull suspense to Sellers and Washington, a weary waiting which might have broken their hearts, maybe, but for the relieving change which they got out of an occasional visit to New York to see Laura. Standing guard in Washington or anywhere else is not an exciting business in time of peace, but standing guard was all that the two friends had to do. All that was needed of them was that they should be on hand and ready for any emergency that might come up. There was no work to do. That was all finished. This was but the second session of the last winter's Congress, and its action on the bill could have but one result, its passage. The House must do its work over again, of course, but the same membership was there to see that it did it. The Senate was secure. Senator Dilworthy was able to put all doubts to rest on that head. Indeed, it was no secret in Washington that a two-thirds vote in the Senate was ready and waiting to be cast for the university bill as soon as it should come before that body. Washington did not take part in the gaieties of the season as he had done the previous winter. He had lost his interest in such things. He was oppressed with cares now. Senator Dilworthy said to Washington that a humble deportment under punishment was best, and that there was but one way in which the troubled heart might find perfect repose and peace. The suggestion found a response in Washington's breast, and the senator saw the sign of it in his face. From that moment one could find the youth with the senator even oftener than with Colonel Sellers. When the statesman presided at great temperance meetings, he placed Washington in the front rank of impressive dignitaries that gave tone to the occasion and pomp to the platform. His bald-headed surroundings made the youth the more conspicuous. When the statesman made remarks in these meetings, he not infrequently alluded with the effect to the encouraging spectacle of one of the wealthiest and most brilliant young favorites of society forsaking the light vanities of that butterfly existence to nobly and self-sacrificingly devote his talents and his riches to the cause of saving his hapless fellow-creatures from shame and misery here and eternal regret hereafter. At the prayer meetings the senator always brought Washington up the aisle on his arm and seated him prominently. In his prayers he referred to him in the cant terms which the senator employed, perhaps unconsciously, and mistook, maybe, for religion, and in other ways brought him into notice. He had him out at gatherings for the benefit of the Negro, gatherings for the benefit of the Indian, gatherings for the benefit of the heathen in distant lands. He had him out time and again before Sunday schools as an example for emulation. Upon all these occasions the senator made casual references to many benevolent enterprises which his ardent young friend was planning against the day when the passage of the university bill should make his means available for the amelioration of the condition of the unfortunate among his fellow-men of all nations and all climes. Thus, as the weeks rolled on, Washington grew up into an imposing lion once more, but a lion that roamed the peaceful fields of religion and temperance, and revisited the glittering domain of fashion no more. A great moral influence was thus brought to bear in favor of the bill. The weightiest of friends flocked to its standard. Its most energetic enemies said it was useless to fight longer. They had tacitly surrendered, while as yet the day of battle was not come. End of chapter 52. This is section 53 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 53. The session was drawing toward its close. Senator Dilworthy thought he would run out west and shake hands with his constituents and let them look at him. The legislature, whose duty it would be to re-elect him to the United States Senate, was already in session. Mr. Dilworthy considered his re-election certain, but he was a careful, painstaking man, and if by visiting his state he could find the opportunity to persuade a few more legislators to vote for him, he held the journey to be well worth taking. The university bill was safe now. He could leave it without fear. It needed his presence and his watching no longer. But there was a person in his state legislature who did need watching, a person who, Senator Dilworthy said, was a narrow, grumbling, uncomfortable malcontent, a person who was stolidly opposed to reform and progress and him, a person who, he feared, had been bought with money to combat him, and through him the Commonwealth's welfare and its politics' purity.
"If this person, noble," said Mr. Dilworthy in a little speech at a dinner party given him by some of his admirers, "merely desired to sacrifice me, I would willingly offer up my political life on the altar of my dear state's weal. I would be glad and grateful to do it. But when he makes of me but a cloak to hide his deeper designs, When he proposes to strike through me at the heart of my beloved state, all the lion in me is roused, and I say here I stand, solitary and alone, but unflinching, unquailing, thrice armed with my sacred trust, and whoso passes to do evil to this fair domain that looks to me for protection must do so over my dead body."
He further said that if this noble were a pure man, and merely misguided, he could bear it, but that he should succeed in his wicked designs through a base use of money would leave a blot upon his state which would work untold evil to the morals of the people, and that he would not suffer. The public morals must not be contaminated. He would seek this man noble, he would argue, he would persuade, he would appeal to his honor. When he arrived on the ground he found his friends unterrified. They were standing firmly by him and were full of courage. Noble was working hard too, but matters were against him. He was not making much progress. Mr. Dilworthy took an early opportunity to send for Mr. Noble. He had a midnight interview with him, and urged him to forsake his evil ways. He begged him to come again and again, which he did. He finally sent the man away at 3 o'clock one morning, and when he was gone, Mr. Dilworthy said to himself,
"I feel a good deal relieved now, a great deal relieved."
The Senator now turned his attention to matters touching the souls of his people. He appeared in church. He took a leading part in prayer meetings. He met and encouraged the temperance societies. He graced the sewing circles of the ladies with his presence, and even took a needle now and then and made a stitch or two upon a calico shirt for some poor Bibleless pagan of the South Seas, and this act enchanted the ladies, who regarded the garments thus honored as in a manner sanctified. The Senator wrought in Bible classes, and nothing could keep him away from the Sunday schools, neither sickness, nor storms, nor weariness. He even traveled a tedious 30 miles in a poor little rickety stage-coach to comply with the desire of the miserable hamlet of Cattleville that he would let its Sunday school look upon him. All the town was assembled at the stage office when he arrived. 2 bonfires were burning, and a battery of anvils was popping exultant broadsides. For a United States Senator was a sort of god in the understanding of these people, who never had seen any creature mightier than a county judge. To them, a United States Senator was a vast, vague colossus, an awe-inspiring unreality. Next day everybody was at the village church, a full half-hour before time for Sunday school to open. Ranchmen and farmers had come with their families from 5 miles around, all eager to get a glimpse of the great man, the man who had been to Washington, the man who had seen the President of the United States, and had even talked with him, the man who had seen the actual Washington Monument, perhaps touched it with his hands. When the Senator arrived, the church was crowded, the windows were full, the aisles were packed, so was the vestibule, and so indeed was the yard in front of the building. As he worked his way through to the pulpit on the arm of the minister, and followed by the envied officials of the village, every neck was stretched and every eye twisted around intervening obstructions to get a glimpse. Elderly people directed each other's attention and said,
"There, that's him, with the grand, noble forehead."
Boys nudged each other and said,
"Hi, Johnny, here he is. There, that's him, with the peeled head."
The Senator took his seat in the pulpit, with the minister on one side of him and the superintendent of the Sunday school on the other. The town dignitaries sat in an impressive row within the altar railings below. The Sunday school children occupied 10 of the front benches, dressed in their best and most uncomfortable clothes, and with hair combed and faces too clean to feel natural. So awed were they by the presence of a living United States Senator that during 3 minutes not a spitball was thrown. After that they began to come to themselves by degrees, and presently the spell was wholly gone, and they were reciting verses and pulling hair. The usual Sunday school exercises were hurried through, and then the minister got up and bored the house with a speech built on the customary Sunday school plan. Then the superintendent put in his oar, then the town dignitaries had their say. They all made complimentary reference to their friend the Senator, and told what a great and illustrious man he was, and what he had done for his country and for religion and temperance, and exhorted the little boys to be good and diligent and try to become like him some day. The speakers won the deathless hatred of the House by these delays, but at last there was an end and hope revived. Inspiration was about to find utterance. Senator Dilworthy rose and beamed upon the assemblage for a full minute in silence. Then he smiled with an access of sweetness upon the children and began. "My little friends, for I hope that all these bright-faced little people are my friends and will let me be their friend, my little friends, I have traveled much. I have been in many cities and many states, everywhere in our great and noble country, and by the blessing of Providence I have been permitted to see many gatherings like this. But I am proud, I am truly proud to say that I never have looked upon so much intelligence, so much grace, such sweetness of disposition as I see in the charming young countenances I see before me at this moment. I have been asking myself as I sat here, where am I? Am I in some far-off monarchy, looking upon little princes and princesses? No. Am I in some populous center of my own country, where the choicest children of the land have been selected and brought together, as at a fair for a prize? No. Am I in some strange foreign clime, where the children are marvels that we know not of? No. Then where am I? Yes, where am I? I am in a simple, remote, unpretending settlement of my own dear state, and these are the children of the noble and virtuous men who have made me what I am. My soul is lost in wonder at the thought, and I humbly thank Him, to whom we are but as worms of the dust, that He has been pleased to call me to serve such men. Earth has no higher, no grander position for me. Let kings and emperors keep their tinsel crowns. I want them not. My heart is here. Again I thought, is this a theater? No. Is it a concert or a gilded opera? No. Is it some other vain, brilliant, beautiful temple of soul-staining amusement and hilarity? No. Then what is it? What did my consciousness reply? I ask you, my little friends, what did my consciousness reply? It replied, "It is the temple of the Lord." Ah, think of that, now. I could hardly keep the tears back, I was so grateful. Oh, how beautiful it is to see these ranks of sunny little faces assembled here to learn the way of life, to learn to be good, to learn to be useful, to learn to be pious, to learn to be great and glorious men and women, to learn to be props and pillars of the state, and shining lights in the councils and the households of the nation, to be bearers of the banner and soldiers of the cross in the rude campaigns of life, and raptured souls in the happy fields of paradise hereafter. Children, honor your parents, and be grateful to them for providing for you the precious privileges of a Sunday school. Now, my dear little friends, sit up straight and pretty, that's it, and give me your attention, and let me tell you about a poor little Sunday school scholar I once knew. He lived in the far West, and his parents were poor. They could not give him a costly education, but they were good and wise, and they sent him to the Sunday school. He loved the Sunday school. I hope you love your Sunday school. Ah, I see by your faces that you do. That is right. Well, this poor little boy was always in his place when the bell rang, and he always knew his lesson, for his teachers wanted him to learn, and he loved his teachers dearly. Always love your teachers, my children, for they love you more than you can know now. He would not let bad boys persuade him to go to play on Sunday.
There was one little bad boy who was always trying to persuade him, but he never could. So this poor little boy grew up to be a man, and had to go out in the world, far from home and friends, to earn his living. Temptations lay all about him, and sometimes he was about to yield, but he would think of some precious lesson he learned in his Sunday school a long time ago, and that would save him. By and by he was elected to the legislature. Then he did everything he could for Sunday schools. He got laws passed for them. He got Sunday schools established wherever he could. And by the people made him governor, and he said it was all owing to the Sunday school. After a while the people elected him a representative to the Congress of the United States, and he grew very famous. Now temptations assailed him on every hand. People tried to get him to drink wine, to dance, to go to theaters. They even tried to buy his vote, but no, the memory of his Sunday school saved him from all harm. He remembered the fate of the bad little boy who used to try to get him to play on Sunday, and who grew up and became a drunkard and was hanged. He remembered that, and was glad he never yielded and played on Sunday. Well, at last, what do you think happened? Why, the people gave him a towering, illustrious position, a grand, imposing position. And what do you think it was? What should you say it was, children? It was Senator of the United States. That poor little boy that loved his Sunday school became that man. That man stands before you. All that he is, he owes to the Sunday school. My precious children, love your parents, love your teachers, love your Sunday school. Be pious, be obedient, be honest, be diligent, and then you will succeed in life and be honored of all men. Above all things, my children, be honest. Above all things be pure-minded as the snow. Let us join in prayer. When Senator Dilworthy departed from Cattleville, he left 36 boys behind him arranging a campaign of life whose objective point was the United States Senate. When he arrived at the state capitol at midnight, Mr. Noble came and held a 3 hours conference with him, and then, as he was about leaving, said, "I've worked hard, and I've got them at last. 6 of them haven't got quite backbone enough to slew around and come right out for you on the first ballot tomorrow, but they're going to vote against you on the first for the sake of appearances, and then come out for you all in a body on the second. I've fixed all that. By supper time tomorrow you'll be re-elected, and you can go to bed and sleep easy on that." After Mr. Noble was gone, the senator said, "Well, to bring about a complexion of things like this was worth coming west for." End of chapter 53.
This is section 54 of The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 54. The case of the State of New York against Laura Hawkins was finally set down for trial on the 15th day of February, less than a year after the shooting of George Selby. If the public had almost forgotten the existence of Laura and her crime, they were reminded of all the details of the murder by the newspapers, which for some days had been announcing the approaching trial. But they had not forgotten. The sex, the age, the beauty of the prisoner, her high social position in Washington, the unparalleled calmness with which the crime was committed, had all conspired to fix the event in the public mind, although nearly 365 subsequent murders had occurred to vary the monotony of metropolitan life. No, the public read from time to time of the lovely prisoner languishing in the city prison, the tortured victim of the law's delay, and as the months went by it was natural that the horror of her crime should become a little indistinct in memory, while the heroine of it should be invested with a sort of sentimental interest. Perhaps her counsel had calculated on this. Perhaps it was by their advice that Laura had interested herself in the unfortunate criminals who shared her prison confinement, and had done not a little to relieve, from her own purse, the necessities of some of the poor creatures. That she had done this the public read in the journals of the day, and the simple announcement cast a softening light upon her character. The courtroom was crowded at an early hour, before the arrival of judges, lawyers, and prisoner. There is no enjoyment so keen to certain minds as that of looking upon the slow torture of a human being on trial for life, except it be an execution. There is no display of human ingenuity, wit, and power so fascinating as that made by trained lawyers in the trial of an important case. Nowhere else is exhibited such subtlety, acumen, address, eloquence. All the conditions of intense excitement meet in a murder trial. The awful issue at stake gives significance to the lightest word or look. How the quick eyes of the spectators rove from the stolid jury to the keen lawyers, the impassive judge, the anxious prisoner. Nothing is lost of the sharp wrangle of the counsel on points of law, the measured decisions of the bench, the duels between the attorneys and the witnesses. The crowd sways with the rise and fall of the shifting testimony in sympathetic interest, and hangs upon the dicta of the judge in breathless silence. It speedily takes sides for or against the accused, and recognizes as quickly its favorites among the lawyers. Nothing delights it more than the sharp retort of a witness and the discomfiture of an obnoxious attorney. A joke, even if it be a lame one, is nowhere so keenly relished or quickly applauded as in a murder trial. Within the bar the young lawyers and the privileged hangers-on filled all the chairs except those reserved at the table for those engaged in the case. Without, the throng occupied all the seats, the window ledges, and the standing room. The atmosphere was already something horrible. It was the peculiar odor of a criminal court, as if it were tainted by the presence, in different persons, of all the crimes that men and women can commit. There was a little stir when the prosecuting attorney, with two assistants, made his way in, seated himself at the table, and spread his papers before him. There was more stir when the counsel of the defense appeared. They were Mr. Braham, the senior, and Mr. Quiggle and Mr. O'Keefe, the juniors. Everybody in the courtroom knew Mr. Braham, the great criminal lawyer, and he was not unaware that he was the object of all eyes as he moved to his place, bowing to his friends in the bar. A large but rather spare man, with broad shoulders and a massive head, covered with chestnut curls which fell down upon his coat-collar, and which he had a habit of shaking as a lion is supposed to shake his mane. His face was clean-shaven, and he had a wide mouth and rather small dark eyes, set quite too near together. Mr. Braham wore a brown frock coat, buttoned across his breast, with a rosebud in the upper buttonhole, and light pantaloons. A diamond stud was seen to flash from his bosom, and as he seated himself and drew off his gloves, a heavy seal ring was displayed upon his white left hand. Mr. Braham, having seated himself, deliberately surveyed the entire house, made a remark to one of his assistants, and then, taking an ivory-handled knife from his pocket, began to pare his finger-nails, rocking his chair backwards and forwards slowly. A moment later Judge O'Shaughnessy entered at the rear door and took his seat in one of the chairs behind the bench. A gentleman in black broadcloth, with sandy hair inclined to curl, a round, reddish, and rather jovial face, sharp rather than intellectual, and with a self-sufficient air. His career had nothing remarkable in it. He was descended from a long line of Irish kings, and he was the first one of them who had ever come into his kingdom, the kingdom of such being the city of New York. He had, in fact, descended so far and so low that he found himself, when a boy, a sort of street Arab in that city, but he had ambition and native shrewdness, and he speedily took to boot-polishing and newspaper-hawking, became the office and errand-boy of a law firm, picked up knowledge enough to get some employment in police courts, was admitted to the bar, became a rising young politician, went to the legislature, and was finally elected to the bench which he now honored. In this democratic country he was obliged to conceal his loyalty under a plebeian aspect. Judge O'Shaughnessy never had a lucrative practice nor a large salary, but he had prudently laid away money, believing that a dependent judge can never be impartial, and he had lands and houses to the value of $300,000 or $400,000. Had he not helped to build and furnish this very court-house? Did he not know that the very spittoon which his judgeship used cost the city the sum of $1,000? As soon as the judge was seated, the court was opened with the "Oyez, oyez" of the officer in his native language, the case called, and the sheriff was directed to bring in the prisoner. In the midst of a profound hush, Laura entered, leaning on the arm of the officer, and was conducted to a seat by her counsel. She was followed by her mother and by Washington Hawkins, who were given seats near her. Laura was very pale, but this pallor heightened the luster of her large eyes and gave a touching sadness to her expressive face. She was dressed in simple black, with exquisite taste, and without an ornament. The thin lace veil which partially covered her face did not so much conceal as heighten her beauty. She would not have entered a drawing-room with more self-poise, nor a church with more haughty humility. There was in her manner or face neither shame nor boldness, and when she took her seat in full view of half the spectators, her eyes were downcast. A murmur of admiration ran through the room. The newspaper reporters made their pencils fly. Mr. Braham again swept his eyes over the house as if in approval. When Laura at length raised her eyes a little, she saw Philip and Harry within the bar, but she gave no token of recognition. The clerk then read the indictment, which was in the usual form. It charged Laura Hawkins, in effect, with the premeditated murder of George Selby by shooting him with a pistol, with a revolver, shotgun, rifle, repeater, breech-loader, cannon, six-shooter, with a gun, or some other weapon; with killing him with a slung-shot, a bludgeon, carving-knife, bowie-knife, pen-knife, rolling-pin, car, hook, dagger, hairpin, with a hammer, with a screwdriver, with a nail, and with all other weapons and utensils whatsoever, at the Southern Hotel, and in all other hotels and places wheresoever, on the 13th day of March, and all other days of the Christian era wheresoever. Laura stood while the long indictment was read, and at the end, in response to the inquiry of the judge, she said in a clear, low voice, "Not guilty." She sat down, and the court proceeded to impanel a jury. The first man called was Michael Lanigan, saloon-keeper. "Have you formed or expressed any opinion on this case, and do you know any of the parties?" "Not any," said Mr. Lanigan. "Have you any conscientious objections to capital punishment?" "No, sir, not to my knowledge." "Have you read anything about this case?" "To be sure, I read the papers, yonner." Objected to by Mr. Braham for cause, and discharged. Patrick Coughlin. "What is your business?" "Well, I haven't got any particular business." "Haven't any particular business, eh? Well, what's your general business? What do you do for a living?" "I own some terriers, sir." "Own some terriers, eh? Keep a rat-pit?" "Gentlemen comes there to have a little sport. I never fit 'em, sir." "Oh, I see. You are probably the amusement committee of the city council. Have you ever heard of this case?" "Not till this morning, sir." "Can you read?" "Not fine print, your honor." The man was about to be sworn when Mr. Braham asked, "Could your father read?" "The old gentleman was mighty handy at that, sir." Mr. Braham submitted that the man was disqualified. Judge thought not. Point argued, challenged peremptorily, and set aside. Ethan Dobb, cart driver. "Can you read?" "Yes, but haven't a habit of it." "Have you heard of this case?" "I think so, but it might be another. I have no opinion about it." There, hold on a bit. Did anybody tell you to say you had no opinion about it?" No, sir." "Take care now, take care. Then what suggested it to you to volunteer that remark?" "Well, they've always asked that when I was on juries." "All right, then. Have you any conscientious scruples about capital punishment?" "Any which?" "Would you object to finding a person guilty of murder on evidence?"
"I might, sir, if I thought he wasn't guilty." The district attorney thought he saw a point. "Would this feeling rather incline you against a capital conviction?" The juror said he hadn't any feeling, and didn't know any of the parties. Accepted and sworn. Dennis Laffin, laborer. Have neither formed nor expressed an opinion. Never had heard of the case. Believed in hangin' for them that deserved it. Could read if it was necessary. Mr. Braham objected. The man was evidently bloody-minded. Challenged peremptorily. Larry O'Toole, contractor. A showily dressed man of the style known as vulgar genteel, had a sharp eye and a ready tongue. Had read the newspaper reports of the case, but they made no impression on him. Should be governed by the evidence. Knew no reason why he could not be an impartial juror. Questioned by district attorney. How is it that the reports made no impression on you?
Never believe anything I see in the newspapers.
Laughter from the crowd. Approving smiles from His Honor and Mr. Braham. Juror sworn in. Mr. Braham whispered to O'Keefe, "That's the man." Avery Hicks, peanut peddler. Did he ever hear of this case? The man shook his head. Can you read? No. Any scruples about capital punishment? No. He was about to be sworn when the district attorney, turning to him carelessly, remarked, "Understand the nature of an oath?" "Outside," said the man, pointing to the door. "I say, do you know what an oath is?"
5 cents,
explained the man.
"Do you mean to insult me?" roared the prosecuting officer. "Are you an idiot? Fresh baked. I'm deaf. I don't hear a word you say."
The man was discharged. He wouldn't have made a bad juror, though, whispered Braham. I saw him looking at the prisoner sympathizingly. That's a point you want to watch for. The result of the whole day's work was the selection of only 2 jurors. These, however, were satisfactory to Mr. Braham. He had kept off all those he did not know. No one knew better than this great criminal lawyer that the battle was fought on the selection of the jury. The subsequent examination of witnesses, the eloquence expended on the jury, are all for effect outside. At least, that is the theory of Mr. Braham. But human nature is a queer thing, he admits. Sometimes jurors are unaccountably swayed. Be as careful as you can in choosing them. It was 4 weary days before this jury was made up, but when it was finally complete, it did great credit to the counsel for the defense. So far as Mr. Braham knew, only 2 could read, one of whom was the foreman, Mr. Braham's friend, the showy contractor. Low foreheads and heavy faces they all had. Some had a look of animal cunning, while the most were only stupid. The entire panel formed that boasted heritage commonly described as the bulwark of our liberties. The district attorney, Mr. McFlynn, opened the case for the state. He spoke with only the slightest accent, one that had been inherited but not cultivated. He contented himself with a brief statement of the case. The state would prove that Laura Hawkins, the prisoner at the bar, a fiend in the form of a beautiful woman, shot dead George Selby, a Southern gentleman, at the time and place described; that the murder was in cold blood, deliberate, and without provocation; that it had been long premeditated and threatened; that she had followed the deceased from Washington to commit it. All this would be proved by unimpeachable witnesses. The attorney added that the duty of the jury, however painful it might be, would be plain and simple. They were citizens, husbands, perhaps fathers. They knew how insecure life had become in the metropolis. Tomorrow our own wives might be widows, their own children orphans, like the bereaved family in yonder hotel, deprived of husband and father by the jealous hand of some murderous female. The attorney sat down, and the clerk called, "Henry Brierly." End of chapter 54. This is section 55 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 55. Henry Brierly took the stand. Requested by the district attorney to tell the jury all he knew about the killing, he narrated the circumstances substantially as the reader already knows them. He accompanied Miss Hawkins to New York at her request,
supposing she was coming in relation to a bill then pending in Congress to secure the attendance of absent members. Her note to him was here shown. She appeared to be very much excited at the Washington station. After she had asked the conductor several questions, he heard her say, "He can't escape." Witness asked her who, and she replied, "Nobody." Did not see her during the night. They traveled in a sleeping car. In the morning she appeared not to have slept, said she had a headache. In crossing the ferry, she asked him about the shipping in sight. He pointed out where the Cunarders lay when in port. They took a cup of coffee that morning at a restaurant. She said she was anxious to reach the Southern Hotel where Mr. Simons, one of the absent members, was staying, before he went out. She was entirely self-possessed, and beyond unusual excitement did not act unnaturally. After she had fired twice at Colonel Selby, she turned the pistol toward her own breast, and Witness snatched it from her. She had been a great deal with Selby in Washington, appeared to be infatuated with him. Cross-examined by Mr. Braham, "Mr. Brierly." Mr. Braham had in perfection this lawyer's trick of annoying a witness by drawling out the Mr., as if unable to recall the name, until the witness is sufficiently aggravated, and then suddenly, with a rising inflection, flinging his name at him with startling unexpectedness.
"Mr. Brierly, what is your occupation?"
"Civil engineer, sir."
Civil engineer," with a glance at the jury. "Following that occupation with Miss Hawkins?"
Smiles by the jury. "No, sir," said Harry, reddening.
"How long have you known the prisoner?"
2 years, sir. I made her acquaintance in Hawkeye, Missouri."
"Mr. Brierly, were you not a lover of Miss Hawkins?"
Objected to.
"I submit, Your Honor, that I have the right to establish the relation of this unwilling witness to the prisoner."
Admitted. "Well, sir," said Harry hesitatingly, "we were friends."
"You act like a friend."
Sarcastically. The jury were beginning to hate this neatly dressed young sprig.
"Mr. Brierly, didn't Miss Hawkins refuse you?"
Harry blushed and stammered and looked at the judge.
"You must answer, sir,"
said his honor. She didn't accept me."
"No, I should think not." "Brierly, do you dare tell the jury that you had no interest in the removal of your rival, Colonel Selby?"
roared Mr. Braham in a voice of thunder. "Nothing like this, sir, nothing like this," protested the witness.
"That's all, sir,"
said Mr. Braham severely.
"One word,"
said the district attorney. "Had you the least suspicion of the prisoner's intention up to the moment of the shooting?" "Not the least," answered Harry earnestly.
"Of course not, of course not,"
nodded Mr. Braham to the jury. The prosecution then put upon the stand the other witnesses of the shooting at the hotel, and the clerk and the attending physicians. The fact of the homicide was clearly established. Nothing new was elicited, except from the clerk, in reply to a question by Mr. Braham, the fact that when the prisoner inquired for Colonel Selby she appeared excited, and there was a wild look in her eyes. The dying deposition of Colonel Selby was then produced. It set forth Laura's threats, but there was a significant addition to it, which the newspaper report did not have. It seemed that after the deposition was taken, as reported, the colonel was told for the first time by his physicians that his wounds were mortal. He appeared to be in great mental agony and fear, and said he had not finished his deposition. He added, with great difficulty and long pauses, these words, "I have not told all. I must tell. Put it down. I wronged her. Years ago. I can't see. Oh, God, I deserved." That was all. He fainted and did not revive again. The Washington railway conductor testified that the prisoner had asked him if a gentleman and his family went out on the evening train, describing the persons he had since learned were Colonel Selby and family. Susan Cullum, colored servant at Senator Dilworthy's, was sworn, knew Colonel Selby, had seen him come to the house often, and be alone in the parlor with Miss Hawkins. He came the day but one before he was shot. She let him in. He appeared flustered like. She heard talking in the parlor. "'Peared like it was quarrelin'." Was afeard somethin' was wrong. Just put her ear to the keyhole of the back parlor door. Heard a man's voice. I can't, good God," quite beggin' like. Heard young Mrs. voice. "Take your choice, then. If you 'bandon me, you knows what to expect." Then he rushes out in the house. I goes in, and I says, "Missus, did you ring?" She was a-standing like a tiger, her eyes flashing. I come right out. This was the substance of Susan's testimony, which was not shaken in the least by severe cross-examination. In reply to Mr. Braham's question, if the prisoner did not look insane, Susan said, "Lord, no, sir, just mad as a hornet." Washington Hawkins was sworn. The pistol, identified by the officer as the one used in the homicide, was produced. Washington admitted that it was his. She had asked him for it one morning, saying she thought she had heard burglars the night before. Admitted that he never had heard burglars in the house. Had anything unusual happened just before that? Nothing that he remembered. Did he accompany her to a reception at Mrs. Schoonmaker's a day or two before? Yes. What occurred? Little by little it was dragged out of the witness that Laura had behaved strangely there, appeared to be sick, and he had taken her home. Upon being pushed, he admitted that she had afterwards confessed that she saw Selby there, and Washington volunteered the statement that Selby was a black-hearted villain. The district attorney said with some annoyance, There, that will do." The defense declined to examine Mr. Hawkins at present. The case for the prosecution was closed. Of the murder there could not be the least doubt, or that the prisoner followed the deceased to New York with a murderous intent. On the evidence the jury must convict, and might do so without leaving their seats. This was the condition of the case 2 days after the jury had been selected. A week had passed since the trial opened, and a Sunday had intervened. The public, who read the reports of the evidence, saw no chance for the prisoner's escape. The crowd of spectators who had watched the trial were moved with the most profound sympathy for Laura. Mr. Braham opened the case for the defense. His manner was subdued, and he spoke in so low a voice that it was only by reason of perfect silence in the courtroom that he could be heard. He spoke very distinctly, however, and if his nationality could be discovered in his speech, it was only in a certain richness and breadth of tone. He began by saying that he trembled at the responsibility he had undertaken, and he should altogether despair if he did not see before him a jury of 12 men of rare intelligence, whose acute minds would unravel all the sophistries of the prosecution, men with a sense of honor, which would revolt at the remorseless persecution of this hunted woman by the state, men with hearts to feel for the wrongs of which she was the victim. Far be it from him to cast any suspicion upon the motives of the able, eloquent, and ingenious lawyers of the state. They act officially. Their business is to convict. It is our business, gentlemen, to see that justice is done.
It is my duty, gentlemen, to unfold to you one of the most affecting dramas in all the history of misfortune. I shall have to show you a life, the sport of fame and circumstances, hurried along through shifting storm and sun, bright with trusting innocence and anon black with heartless villainy, a career which moves on in love and desertion and anguish, always hovered over by the dark spectre of insanity, an insanity hereditary and induced by mental torture, until it ends, if end it must in your verdict, by one of those fearful accidents which are inscrutable to men, and of which God alone knows the secret. Gentlemen, I shall ask you to go with me away from this courtroom and its minions of the law, away from the scene of this tragedy, to a distant, I wish I could say, a happier day. The story I have to tell is of a lovely little girl, with sunny hair and laughing eyes, traveling with her parents, evidently people of wealth and refinement, upon a Mississippi steamboat. There is an explosion, one of those terrible catastrophes which leave the imprint of an unsettled mind upon the survivors. Hundreds of mangled remains are sent into eternity. When the wreck is cleared away, this sweet little girl is found among the panic-stricken survivors, in the midst of a scene of horror enough to turn the steadiest brain. Her parents have disappeared. Search even for their bodies is in vain. The bewildered, stricken child, who can say what changes the fearful event wrought in her tender brain, clings to the first person who shows her sympathy. It is Mrs. Hawkins, this good lady who is still her loving friend. Laura is adopted into the Hawkins family. Perhaps she forgets in time that she is not their child. She is an orphan. No, gentlemen, I will not deceive you. She is not an orphan. Worse than that, there comes another day of agony. She knows that her father lives. Who is he? Where is he? Alas, I cannot tell you. Through the scenes of this painful history he flits here and there, a lunatic. If he seeks his daughter, it is the purposeless search of a lunatic, as one who wanders bereft of reason, crying, "Where is my child?" Laura seeks her father. In vain, just as she is about to find him, again and again, he disappears. He is gone, he vanishes. But this is only the prologue to the tragedy. Bear with me while I relate it.
Mr. Braham takes out a handkerchief, unfolds it slowly, crashes it in his nervous hand, and throws it on the table.
Laura grew up in her humble Southern home, a beautiful creature, the joy of the house, the pride of the neighborhood, the loveliest flower in all the sunny South. She might yet have been happy. She was happy. But the destroyer came into this paradise. He plucked the sweetest bud that grew there, and having enjoyed its odor, trampled it in the mire beneath his feet. George Selby, the deceased, a handsome, accomplished Confederate colonel, was this human fiend. He deceived her with a mock marriage. After some months he brutally abandoned her, and spurned her as if she were a contemptible thing. All the time he had a wife in New Orleans. Laura was crushed. For weeks, as I shall show you by the testimony of her adopted mother and brother, she hovered over death in delirium. Gentlemen, did she ever emerge from this delirium? I shall show you that when she recovered her health, her mind was changed. She was not what she had been. You can judge yourselves whether the tottering reason ever recovered its throne. Years pass. She is in Washington, apparently the happy favorite of a brilliant society. Her family have become enormously rich by one of those sudden turns in fortune that the inhabitants of America are familiar with, the discovery of immense mineral wealth in some wild lands owned by them. She is engaged in a vast philanthropic scheme for the benefit of the poor by the use of this wealth. But, alas, even here and now, the same relentless fate pursued her. The villain Selby appears again upon the scene, as if on purpose to complete the ruin of her life. He appeared to taunt her with her dishonor. He threatened exposure if she did not become again the mistress of his passion. Gentlemen, do you wonder if this woman, thus pursued, lost her reason, was beside herself with fear, and that her wrongs preyed upon her mind until she was no longer responsible for her acts? I turn away my head as one who would not willingly look even upon the just vengeance of heaven.
Mr. Braham paused, as if overcome by his emotions. Mrs. Hawkins and Washington were in tears, as were many of the spectators also. The jury looked scared.
Gentlemen, in this condition of affairs it needed but a spark, I do not say a suggestion, I do not say a hint, from this butterfly Brierly, this rejected rival, to cause the explosion. I make no charges, but if this woman was in her right mind when she fled from Washington and reached this city in company with Brierly, then I do not know what insanity is.
Mr. Braham sat down. He felt that he had the jury with him. A burst of applause followed, which the officer promptly suppressed. Laura, with tears in her eyes, turned a grateful look upon her counsel. All the women among the spectators saw the tears and wept also. They thought, as they also looked at Mr. Braham, how handsome he is. Mrs. Hawkins took the stand. She was somewhat confused to be the target of so many eyes, but her honest and good face at once told in Laura's favor.
"Mrs. Hawkins," said Mr. Braham, "will you be kind enough to state the circumstances of your finding Laura?"
"I object," said Mr. McFlynn, rising to his feet. "This has nothing whatever to do with the case, Your Honor. I am surprised at it, even after the extraordinary speech of my learned friend." "How do you propose to connect it, Mr. Braham?" asked the judge.
"If it please the court," said Mr. Braham, rising impressively,
"Your Honor has permitted the prosecution, and I have submitted without a word, to go into the most extraordinary testimony to establish a motive. Are we to be shut out from showing that the motive attributed to us could not by reason of certain mental conditions exist? I propose, may it please your Honor, to show the cause and the origin of an aberration of mind, to follow it up with other like evidence, connecting it with the very moment of the homicide, showing a condition of the intellect of the prisoner that precludes responsibility."
"The State must insist upon its objections," said the district attorney. "The purpose evidently is to open the door to a mass of irrelevant testimony, the object of which is to produce an effect upon the jury your Honor well understands." "Perhaps," suggested the judge, "the court ought to hear the testimony and exclude it afterwards if it is irrelevant."
"Will your Honor hear argument on that?"
"Certainly." And argument his Honor did hear, or pretend to, for 2 whole days, from all the counsel in turn, in the course of which the lawyers read contradictory decisions enough to perfectly establish both sides, from volume after volume, whole libraries in fact, until no mortal man could say what the rules were. The question of insanity in all its legal aspects was of course drawn into the discussion, and its application affirmed and denied. The case was felt to turn upon the admission or rejection of this evidence. It was a sort of test trial of strength between the lawyers. At the end the judge decided to admit the testimony, as the judge usually does in such cases, after a sufficient waste of time in what are called arguments. Mrs. Hawkins was allowed to go on. End of chapter 55. This is section 56 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 56. Mrs. Hawkins, slowly and conscientiously, as if every detail of her family history was important, told the story of the steamboat explosion, of the finding and adoption of Laura. Silas, that is, Mr. Hawkins, and she always loved Laura, as if she had been their own child. She then narrated the circumstances of Laura's supposed marriage, her abandonment and long illness, in a manner that touched all hearts. Laura had been a different woman since then. Cross-examined, at the time of first finding Laura on a steamboat, did she notice that Laura's mind was at all deranged? She couldn't say that she did. After the recovery of Laura from her long illness, did Mrs. Hawkins think there were any signs of insanity about her? Witness confessed that she did not think of it then. Redirect examination.
But she was different after that?
Oh, yes, sir. Washington Hawkins corroborated his mother's testimony as to Laura's connection with Colonel Selby. He was at Harding during the time of her living there with him. After Colonel Selby's desertion, she was almost dead, never appeared to know anything rightly for weeks. He added that he never saw such a scoundrel as Selby. Checked by District Attorney. Had he noticed any change in Laura after her illness? Oh, yes. Whenever any allusion was made that might recall Selby to mind, she looked awful, as if she could kill him.
"You mean," said Mr. Braham, "that there was an unnatural, insane gleam in her eyes?"
Well, yes, certainly, said Washington in confusion. All this was objected to by the District Attorney, but it was got before the jury, and Mr. Braham did not care how much it was ruled out after that. Beriah Sellers was the next witness called. The colonel made his way to the stand with majestic yet bland deliberation. Having taken the oath and kissed the Bible with a smack intended to show his great respect for that book, he bowed to his honor with dignity, to the jury with familiarity, and then turned to the lawyers and stood in an attitude of superior attention.
"Mr. Sellers, I believe," began Mr. Braham.
"Beriah Sellers, Missouri," was the courteous acknowledgment that the lawyer was correct.
"Mr. Sellers, you know the parties here. You are a friend of the family." "Know them all, from infancy, sir. It was me, sir, that induced Silas Hawkins, Judge Hawkins, to come to Missouri and make his fortune. It was by my advice, and in company with me, sir, that he went into the operation of—"
"Yes, yes, Mr. Sellers. Did you know a Major Lackland?"
"Knew him well, sir, knew him and honored him, sir. He was one of the most remarkable men of our country, sir. A member of Congress. He was often at my mansion, sir, for weeks. He used to say to me, 'Colonel Sellers, if you would go into politics, if I had you for a colleague, we should show Calhoun and Webster that the brain of the country didn't lie east of the Alleghanies.' But I said—"
"Yes, yes, I believe Major Lackland is not living, Colonel." There was an almost imperceptible sense of pleasure betrayed in the colonel's face at this prompt acknowledgment of his title.
"Bless you, no. Died years ago, a miserable death, sir. A ruined man, a poor sot. He was suspected of selling his vote in Congress, and probably he did. The disgrace killed him. He was an outcast, sir, loathed by himself and by his constituents. And I think, sir—"
The judge.
"You will confine yourself, Colonel Sellers, to the questions of the counsel."
"Of course, your honor. This," continued the colonel in confidential explanation,
"was 20 years ago. I shouldn't have thought of referring to such a trifling circumstance now. If I remember rightly, sir—"
A bundle of letters was here handed to the witness.
"Do you recognize that handwriting?" "As if it was my own, sir. It's Major Lackland's. I was knowing to these letters when Judge Hawkins received them."
The colonel's memory was a little at fault here. Mr. Hawkins had never gone into details with him on this subject.
"He used to show them to me and say, 'Colonel Sellers, you've a mind to untangle this sort of thing.' Lord, how everything comes back to me. Laura was a little thing then. The judge and I were just laying our plans to buy the Pilot Knob, and—"
"Colonel, one moment. Your honor, we put these letters in evidence." The letters were a portion of the correspondence of Major Lackland with Silas Hawkins. Parts of them were missing, and important letters were referred to that were not here. They related, as the reader knows, to Laura's father. Lackland had come upon the track of a man who was searching for a lost child in a Mississippi steamboat explosion years before. The man was lame in one leg, and appeared to be flitting from place to place. It seemed that Major Lackland got so close track of him that he was able to describe his personal appearance and learn his name. But the letter containing these particulars was lost. Once he heard of him at a hotel in Washington, but the man departed, leaving an empty trunk, the day before the Major went there. There was something very mysterious in all his movements. Colonel Sellers, continuing his testimony, said that he saw this lost letter, but could not now recall the name. Search for the supposed father had been continued by Lackland,
Hawkins, and himself for several years, but Laura was not informed of it till after the death of Hawkins, for fear of raising false hopes in her mind. Here the district attorney arose and said, "Your Honor, I must positively object to letting the witness wander off into all these irrelevant details." Mr. Braham, "I submit, Your Honor, that we cannot be interrupted in this manner. We have suffered the State to have full swing. Now here is a witness who has known the prisoner from infancy and is competent to testify upon the one point vital to her safety. Evidently he is a gentleman of character, and his knowledge of the case cannot be shut out without increasing the aspect of persecution which the State's attitude towards the prisoner already has assumed." The wrangle continued, waxing hotter and hotter. The Colonel, seeing the attention of the counsel and the court entirely withdrawn from him, thought he perceived here his opportunity. Turning and beaming upon the jury, he began simply to talk, but as the grandeur of his position grew upon him, his talk broadened unconsciously into an oratorical vein. "You see how she was situated, gentlemen. Poor child, it might have broken her heart to let her mind get to running on such a thing as that. You see, from what we could make out, her father was lame in the left leg and had a deep scar on his left forehead. And so, ever since the day she found out she had another father, she never could run across a lame stranger without being taken all over with a shiver, and almost fainting where she stood, and the next minute she would go right after that man. Once she stumbled on a stranger with a game leg, and she was the most grateful thing in this world. But it was the wrong leg, and it was days and days before she could leave her bed. Once she found a man with a scar on his forehead, and she was just going to throw herself into his arms, but he stepped out just then, and there wasn't anything the matter with his legs. Time and time again, gentlemen of the jury, has this poor suffering orphan flung herself on her knees with all her heart's gratitude in her eyes before some scarred and crippled veteran, but always to be disappointed, always to be plunged into new despair. If his legs were right, his scar was wrong. If his scar was right, his legs were wrong. Never could find a man that would fill the bill. Gentlemen of the jury, you have hearts, you have feelings, you have warm human sympathies. You can feel for this poor suffering child. Gentlemen of the jury, if I had time, if I had the opportunity, if I might be permitted to go on and tell you the thousands and thousands and thousands of mutilated strangers this poor girl has started out of cover, and hunted from city to city, from state to state, from continent to continent, till she has run them down and found they weren't the ones. I know your hearts." By this time the Colonel had become so warmed up that his voice had reached a pitch above that of the contending counsel. The lawyers suddenly stopped, and they and the judge turned towards the Colonel, and remained for several seconds too surprised at this novel exhibition to speak. In this interval of silence, an appreciation of the situation gradually stole over the audience, and an explosion of laughter followed, in which even the court and the bar could hardly keep from joining. Sheriff: "Order in the court!" The Judge: "The witness will confine his remarks to answers to questions." The Colonel turned courteously to the Judge and said, "Certainly, Your Honor, certainly. I am not well acquainted with the forms of procedure in the courts of New York, but in the West, sir, in the West—" The Judge: There, that will do, that will do. "You see, Your Honor, there were no questions asked me, and I thought I would take advantage of the lull in the proceedings to explain to the jury a very significant train of—" The Judge: "That will do, sir. Proceed, Mr. Braham." "Colonel Sellers, have you any reason to suppose that this man is still living?" "Every reason, sir, every reason." "State why." "I have never heard of his death, sir. It has never come to my knowledge. In fact, sir, as I once said to Governor—" "Will you state to the jury what has been the effect of the knowledge of this wandering and evidently unsettled being, supposed to be her father, upon the mind of Miss Hawkins for so many years?" Question objected to. Question ruled out. Cross-examined: "Major Sellers, what is your occupation?"
The colonel looked about him loftily, as if casting in his mind what would be the proper occupation of a person of such multifarious interests, and then said with dignity,
"A gentleman, sir. My father used to always say, sir—"
"Captain Sellers, did you ever see this man, this supposed father?"
"No, sir. But upon one occasion old Senator Thompson said to me, 'It's my opinion, Colonel Sellers—'"
"Did you ever see anybody who had seen him?"
"No, sir. It was reported around at one time that—"
"That is all." The defense then spent a day in the examination of medical experts in insanity, who testified, on the evidence heard, that sufficient causes had occurred to produce an insane mind in the prisoner. Numerous cases were cited to sustain this opinion. There was such a thing as momentary insanity, in which the person, otherwise rational to all appearances, was for the time actually bereft of reason and not responsible for his acts. The causes of this momentary possession could often be found in the person's life. It afterwards came out that the chief expert for the defense was paid $1,000 for looking into the case. The prosecution consumed another day in the examination of experts refuting the notion of insanity. These causes might have produced insanity, but there was no evidence that they have produced it in this case, or that the prisoner was not at the time of the commission of the crime in full possession of her ordinary faculties. The trial had now lasted 2 weeks. It required 4 days now for the lawyers to sum up. These arguments of the counsel were very important to their friends, and greatly enhanced their reputation at the bar, but they have small interest to us. Mr. Braham, in his closing speech, surpassed himself. His effort is still remembered as the greatest in the criminal annals of New York. Mr. Braham redrew for the jury the picture of Laura's early life. He dwelt long upon that painful episode of the pretended marriage and the desertion. Colonel Selby, he said, belonged, gentlemen, to what is called the upper classes. It is the privilege of the upper classes to prey upon the sons and daughters of the people. The Hawkins family, though allied to the best blood of the South, were at the time in humble circumstances. He commented upon her parentage. Perhaps her agonized father, in his intervals of sanity, was still searching for his lost daughter. Would he one day hear that she had died a felon's death? Society had pursued her, fate had pursued her, and in a moment of delirium she had turned and defied fate and society. He dwelt upon the admission of base wrong in Colonel Selby's dying statement. He drew a vivid picture of the villain at last overtaken by the vengeance of heaven. Would the jury say that this retributive justice, inflicted by an outraged and deluded woman, rendered irrational by the most cruel wrongs, was in the nature of a foul, premeditated murder?
"Gentlemen, it is enough for me to look upon the life of this most beautiful and accomplished of her sex, blasted by the heartless villainy of man, without seeing, at the end of it, the horrible spectacle of a gibbet. Gentlemen, we are all human. We have all sinned. We all have need of mercy. But I do not ask mercy of you who are the guardians of society and of the poor waifs, its sometimes wronged victims. I ask only that justice which you and I shall need in that last dreadful hour, when death will be robbed of half its terrors, if we can reflect that we have never wronged a human being. Gentlemen, the life of this lovely and once happy girl, this now stricken woman, is in your hands."
The jury were visibly affected. Half the courtroom was in tears. If a vote of both spectators and jury could have been taken then, the verdict would have been,
"Let her go, she has suffered enough."
But the district attorney had the closing argument. Calmly and without malice or excitement, he reviewed the testimony. As the cold facts were unrolled, fear settled upon the listeners. There was no escape from the murder or its premeditation. Laura's character as a lobbyist in Washington, which had been made to appear incidentally in the evidence, was also against her. The whole body of the testimony of the defense was shown to be irrelevant, introduced only to excite sympathy.
and not giving a color of probability to the absurd supposition of insanity. The attorney then dwelt upon the insecurity of life in the city, and the growing immunity with which women committed murders. Mr. McFlynn made a very able speech, convincing the reason without touching the feelings. The judge in his charge reviewed the testimony with great show of impartiality. He ended by saying that the verdict must be acquittal or murder in the first degree. If you find that the prisoner committed a homicide in possession of her reason and with premeditation, your verdict will be accordingly. If you find she was not in her right mind, that she was the victim of insanity, hereditary or momentary, as it has been explained, your verdict will take that into account. As the judge finished his charge, the spectators anxiously watched the faces of the jury. It was not a remunerative study. In the courtroom the general feeling was in favor of Laura, but whether this feeling extended to the jury, their stolid faces did not reveal. The public outside hoped for a conviction, as it always does. It wanted an example. The newspapers trusted the jury would have the courage to do its duty. When Laura was convicted, then the public would turn around and abuse the governor if he did not pardon her. The jury went out. Mr. Braham preserved his serene confidence, but Laura's friends were dispirited. Washington and Colonel Sellers had been obliged to go to Washington, and they had departed under the unspoken fear the verdict would be unfavorable. A disagreement was the best they could hope for, and money was needed. The necessity of the passage of the university bill was now imperative. The court waited for some time, but the jury gave no signs of coming in. Mr. Braham said it was extraordinary. The court then took a recess for a couple of hours. Upon again coming in, word was brought that the jury had not yet agreed. But the jury had a question. The point upon which they wanted instruction was this. They wanted to know if Colonel Sellers was related to the Hawkins family. The court then adjourned till morning. Mr. Braham, who was in something of a pet, remarked to Mr. O'Toole that they must have been deceived. That juryman with the broken nose could read. End of chapter 56. This is section 57 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 57. The momentous day was at hand, a day that promised to make or mar the fortunes of the Hawkins family for all time. Washington Hawkins and Colonel Sellers were both up early, for neither of them could sleep. Congress was expiring, and was passing bill after bill, as if they were gasps, and each likely to be its last. The university was on file for its third reading this day, and tomorrow Washington would be a millionaire, and Sellers no longer impecunious. But this day also, or at farthest the next, the jury in Laura's case would come to a decision of some kind or other. They would find her guilty, Washington secretly feared, and then the care and the trouble would all come back again, and there would be wearing months of besieging judges for new trials. On this day also the re-election of Mr. Dilworthy to the Senate would take place. So Washington's mind was in a state of turmoil. There were more interests at stake than it could handle with serenity. He exulted when he thought of his millions. He was filled with dread when he thought of Laura. But Sellers was excited and happy. He said, "Everything is going right. Everything's going perfectly right. Pretty soon the telegrams will begin to rattle in, and then you'll see, my boy. Let the jury do what they please. What difference is it going to make? Tomorrow we can send $1 million to New York and set the lawyers at work on the judges. Bless your heart, they will go before judge after judge and exhort and beseech and pray and shed tears. They always do. They always win, too. And they will win this time. They will get a writ of habeas corpus, and a stay of proceedings, and a supersedious, and a new trial, and a nolle prosequi, and there you are. That's the routine, and it's no trick at all to a New York lawyer. That's the regular routine. Everything's red tape and routine in the law, you see. It's all Greek to you, of course, but to a man who is acquainted with those things it's mere— I'll explain it to you sometime.
Everything's going to glide right along easy and comfortable now. You'll see, Washington. You'll see how it will be. And then, let me think, Dilworthy will be elected today, and by day after tomorrow night he will be in New York ready to put in his shovel. And you haven't lived in Washington all this time not to know that the people who walk right by a senator whose term is up without hardly seeing him will be down at the depot to say, "Welcome back, and God bless you, Senator, I'm glad to see you, sir," when he comes along, back re-elected, you know. Well, you see, his influence was naturally running low when he left here, but now he has got a new 6 years' start, and his suggestions will simply just weigh a couple of tons apiece day after tomorrow. Lord bless you, he could rattle through that habeas corpus and supersedious and all those things for Laura all by himself if he wanted to, when he gets back.
I hadn't thought of that, said Washington, brightening. But it is so. A newly elected senator is a power, I know that.
Yes, indeed he is. Why, it is just human nature. Look at me. When we first came here I was Mr. Sellers and Major Sellers and Captain Sellers, but nobody could ever get it right somehow. But the minute our bill went through the House I was Colonel Sellers every time, and nobody could do enough for me. And whatever I said was wonderful, sir. It was always wonderful. I never seemed to say any flat things at all. It was, "Colonel, won't you come and dine with us?" and, "Colonel, why don't we ever see you at our house?" and the Colonel says this, and the Colonel says that, and we know such and such is so-and-so because husband heard Colonel Sellers say so. Don't you see? Well, the Senate adjourned and left our bill high and dry, and I'll be hanged if I weren't old Sellers from that day till our bill passed the House again last week. Now I'm the Colonel again, and if I were to eat all the dinners I am invited to, I reckon I'd wear my teeth down level with my gums in a couple of weeks.
Well, I do wonder what you will be tomorrow, Colonel, after the President signs the bill.
General, sir. General without a doubt. Yes, sir, tomorrow it will be General. Let me congratulate you, sir. General, you've done a great work, sir. You've done a great work for the Negro. Gentlemen, allow me the honor to introduce my friend General Sellers, the humane friend of the Negro. Lord bless me, you'll see the newspapers say, "General Sellers and servants arrived in the city last night and is stopping at the Fifth Avenue," and "General Sellers has accepted a reception and banquet by the Cosmopolitan Club." You'll see the General's opinions quoted, too, and what the General has to say about the propriety of a new trial and a habeas corpus for the unfortunate Miss Hawkins will not be without weight in influential quarters, I can tell you.
And I want to be the first to shake your faithful old hand and salute you with your new honors, and I want to do it now, General, said Washington, suiting the action to the word, and accompanying it with all the meaning that a cordial grasp and eloquent eyes could give it. The Colonel was touched. He was pleased and proud, too. His face answered for that. Not very long after breakfast the telegrams began to arrive. The first was from Braham, and ran thus: "We feel certain that the verdict will be rendered today. Be it good or bad, let it find us ready to make the next move instantly, whatever it may be."
"Well, that's the right talk," said Sellers. "That Braham's a wonderful man. He was the only man there that really understood me. He told me so himself afterwards."
The next telegram was from Mr. Dilworthy.
"I have not only brought over the great Invincible, but through him a dozen more of the opposition. Shall be re-elected today by an overwhelming majority." "Good again," said the Colonel. "That man's talent for organization is something marvelous. He wanted me to go out there and engineer that thing, but I said, 'No, Dilworthy, I must be on hand here, both on Laura's account and the bill's.' 'But you've no trifling genius for organization yourself,' said I, and I was right. 'You go ahead,' said I. 'You can fix it,' and so he has. But I claim no credit for that. If I stiffened up his backbone a little, I simply put him in the way to make his fight, didn't make it myself. He has captured Noble. I consider that a splendid piece of diplomacy. Splendid, sir."
By and by came another dispatch from New York. "Jury still out. Laura calm and firm as a statue. The report that the jury have brought her in guilty is false and premature." "Premature!" gasped Washington, turning white. "Then they all expect that sort of a verdict when it comes." And so did he. But he had not had courage enough to put it into words. He had been preparing himself for the worst, but after all his preparation the bare suggestion of the possibility of such a verdict struck him cold as death. The friends grew impatient now. The telegrams did not come fast enough. Even the lightning could not keep up with their anxieties. They walked the floor, talking disjointedly, and listening for the doorbell. Telegram after telegram came, still no result. By and by there was one which contained a single line: "Court now coming in after brief recess to hear verdict. Jury ready." "Oh, I wish they would finish," said Washington. "This suspense is killing me by inches." Then came another telegram: "Another hitch somewhere. Jury want a little more time and further instructions." "Well, well, well, this is trying," said the colonel, and after a pause, "No dispatch from Dilworthy for 2 hours now. Even a dispatch from him would be better than nothing, just to vary this thing." They waited 20 minutes. It seemed like 20 hours. "Come," said Washington, "I can't wait for the telegraph boy to come all the way up here. Let's go down to Newspaper Row, meet him on the way." While they were passing along the avenue, they saw someone putting up a great display sheet on the bulletin board of a newspaper office, and an eager crowd of men was collecting about the place. Washington and the colonel ran to the spot and read this: "Tremendous sensation. Startling news from Saints Rest. On first ballot for U.S. Senator, when voting was about to begin, Mr. Noble rose in his place and drew forth a package, walked forward and laid it on the Speaker's desk, saying, 'This contains $7,000 in bank bills and was given me by Senator Dilworthy in his bedchamber at midnight last night to buy my vote for him. I wish the Speaker to count the money and retain it to pay the expenses of prosecuting this infamous traitor for bribery.'" The whole legislature was stricken speechless with dismay and astonishment. Noble further said that there were 50 members present with money in their pockets, placed there by Dilworthy to buy their votes. Amidst unparalleled excitement the ballot was now taken, and J.W. Smith elected U.S. Senator, Dilworthy receiving not one vote. Noble promises damaging exposures concerning Dilworthy and certain measures of his now pending in Congress. "Good heavens and earth!" exclaimed the colonel. "To the Capitol," said Washington. "Fly!" And they did fly. Long before they got there, the newsboys were running ahead of them with extras, hot from the press, announcing the astounding news. Arrived in the gallery of the Senate, the friends saw a curious spectacle. Every senator held an extra in his hand, and looked as interested as if it contained news of the destruction of the earth. Not a single member was paying the least attention to the business of the hour. The secretary, in loud voice, was just beginning to read the title of a bill: "House Bill Number 4231, an act to found and incorporate the Knobs Industrial University. Read first and second time, considered in committee of the whole, ordered engrossed, and passed to third reading and final passage." The President: "Third reading of the bill." The two friends shook in their shoes. Senators threw down their extras and snatched a word or two with each other in whispers. Then the gavel rapped to command silence while the names were called on the ayes and nays. Washington grew paler and paler, weaker and weaker while the lagging list progressed, and when it was finished his head fell helplessly forward on his arms. The fight was fought, the long struggle was over, and he was a pauper. Not a man had voted for the bill. Colonel Sellers was bewildered and well-nigh paralyzed himself. But no man could long consider his own troubles in the presence of such suffering as Washington's. He got him up and supported him, almost carried him, indeed, out of the building and into a carriage. All the way home Washington lay with his face against the colonel's shoulder and merely groaned and wept. The colonel tried as well as he could, under the dreary circumstances, to hearten him a little, but it was of no use. Washington was past all hope of cheer now. He only said, "Oh, it is all over. It is all over for good, Colonel. We must beg our bread now. We never can get up again. It was our last chance, and it is gone. They will hang Laura. My God, they will hang her. Nothing can save the poor girl now. Oh, I wish with all my soul they would hang me instead." Arrived at home, Washington fell into a chair and buried his face in his hands and gave full way to his misery. The colonel did not know where to turn, nor what to do. The servant maid knocked at the door and passed in a telegram, saying it had come while they were gone. The colonel tore it open and read with the voice of a man-of-war's broadside, "Verdict of jury not guilty, and Laura is free."
End of chapter 57. This is section 58. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 58. The courtroom was packed on the morning on which the verdict of the jury was expected, as it had been every day of the trial, and by the same spectators who had followed its progress with such intense interest. There is a delicious moment of excitement which the frequenter of trials well knows, and which he would not miss for the world. It is that instant when the foreman of the jury stands up to give the verdict, and before he has opened his fateful lips. The court assembled and waited. It was an obstinate jury. It even had another question, this intelligent jury, to ask the judge this morning. The question was this: were the doctors clear that the deceased had no disease which might soon have carried him off, if he had not been shot? There was evidently one juryman who didn't want to waste life, and was willing to stake a general average, as the jury always does in a civil case, deciding not according to the evidence, but reaching the verdict by some occult mental process. During the delay the spectators exhibited unexampled patience, finding amusement and relief in the slightest movements of the court, the prisoner, and the lawyers. Mr. Braham divided with Laura the attention of the House. Bets were made by the sheriff's deputies on the verdict, with large odds in favor of a disagreement. It was afternoon when it was announced that the jury was coming in. The reporters took their places and were all attention. The judge and lawyers were in their seats. The crowd swayed and pushed in eager expectancy as the jury walked in and stood up in silence. Judge: "Gentlemen, have you agreed upon your verdict?" Foreman: "We have." Judge: "What is it?" Foreman: "Not guilty." A shout went up from the entire room, and a tumult of cheering which the court in vain attempted to quell. For a few moments all order was lost. The spectators crowded within the bar and surrounded Laura, who, calmer than anyone else, was supporting her aged mother, who had almost fainted from excess of joy. And now occurred one of those beautiful incidents which no fiction writer would dare to imagine, a scene of touching pathos, creditable to our fallen humanity. In the eyes of the women of the audience, Mr. Braham was the hero of the occasion. He had saved the life of the prisoner, and besides, he was such a handsome man. The women could not restrain their long pent-up emotions. They threw themselves upon Mr. Braham in a transport of gratitude. They kissed him again and again, the young as well as the advanced in years, the married as well as the ardent single women. They improved the opportunity with a touching self-sacrifice. In the words of a newspaper of the day, they "lavished him with kisses." It was something sweet to do, and it would be sweet for a woman to remember in after years that she had kissed Braham. Mr. Braham himself received these fond assaults with the gallantry of his nation, enduring the ugly and heartily paying back beauty in its own coin. This beautiful scene is still known in New York as the kissing of Braham. When the tumult of congratulation had a little spent itself, and order was restored, Judge O'Shaughnessy said that it now became his duty to provide for the proper custody and treatment of the acquitted. The verdict of the jury having left no doubt that the woman was of an unsound mind, with a kind of insanity dangerous to the safety of the community, she could not be permitted to go at large. In accordance with the directions of the law in such cases, said the judge, and in obedience to the dictates of a wise humanity, I hereby commit Laura Hawkins to the care of the superintendent of the State Hospital for Insane Criminals, to be held in confinement until the State Commissioners on Insanity shall order her discharge. Mr. Sheriff, you will attend at once to the execution of this decree. Laura was overwhelmed and terror-stricken. She had expected to walk forth in freedom in a few moments. The revulsion was terrible. Her mother appeared like one shaken with an ague fit. Laura insane, and about to be locked up with madmen. She had never contemplated this. Mr. Graham said he should move at once for a writ of habeas corpus. But the judge could not do less than his duty. The law must have its way. As in the stupor of a sudden calamity, and not fully comprehending it, Mrs. Hawkins saw Laura led away by the officer. With little space for thought, she was rapidly driven to the railway station and conveyed to the hospital for lunatic criminals. It was only when she was within this vast and grim abode of madness that she realized the horror of her situation. It was only when she was received by the kind physician, and read pity in his eyes, and saw his look of hopeless incredulity when she attempted to tell him that she was not insane. It was only when she passed through the ward to which she was consigned and saw the horrible creatures, the victims of a double calamity, whose dreadful faces she was hereafter to see daily, and was locked into the small, bare room that was to be her home, that all her fortitude forsook her. She sank upon the bed as soon as she was left alone, she had been searched by the matron, and tried to think. But her brain was in a whirl. She recalled Graham's speech, she recalled the testimony regarding her lunacy. She wondered if she were not mad. She felt that she soon should be among these loathsome creatures. Better almost to have died than to slowly go mad in this confinement. We beg the reader's pardon. This is not history, which has just been written. It is really what would have occurred if this were a novel. If this were a work of fiction, we should not dare to dispose of Laura otherwise. True art and any attention to dramatic proprieties required it. The novelist who would turn loose upon society an insane murderess could not escape condemnation. Besides the safety of society, the decencies of criminal procedure, what we call our modern civilization, all would demand that Laura should be disposed of in the manner we have described. Foreigners who read this sad story will be unable to understand any other termination of it. But this is history and not fiction. There is no such law or custom as that to which His Honor is supposed to have deferred. Judge O'Shaughnessy would not probably pay any attention to it if there were. There is no hospital for insane criminals. There is no State Commission of Lunacy. What actually occurred when the tumult in the courtroom had subsided the sagacious reader will now learn. Laura left the courtroom, accompanied by her mother and other friends, amid the congratulations of those assembled, and was cheered as she entered a carriage and drove away. How sweet was the sunlight! How exhilarating the sense of freedom! Were not these following cheers the expression of popular approval and affection? Was she not the heroine of the hour? It was with a feeling of triumph that Laura reached her hotel, a scornful feeling of victory over society with its own weapons. Mrs. Hawkins shared not at all in this feeling. She was broken with disgrace and the long anxiety. "Thank God, Laura," she said, "it is over. Now we will go away from this hateful city. Let us go home at once." "Mother," replied Laura, speaking with some tenderness, "I cannot go with you. There, don't cry. I cannot go back to that life." Mrs. Hawkins was sobbing. This was more cruel than anything else, for she had a dim notion of what it would be to leave Laura to herself. "No, mother, you have been everything to me. You know how dearly I love you, but I cannot go back." A boy brought in a telegraphic dispatch. Laura took it and read, "The bill is lost. Dilworthy ruined. Signed, Washington." For a moment the words swam before her eyes. The next her eyes flashed fire as she handed the dispatch to her mother, and bitterly said, "The world is against me. Well, let it be, let it. I am against it." "This is a cruel disappointment," said Mrs. Hawkins, to whom one grief more or less did not much matter now, "to you and Washington, but we must humbly bear it." "Bear it!" replied Laura scornfully. "I've all my life borne it, and fate has thwarted me at every step." A servant came to the door to say that there was a gentleman below who wished to speak with Miss Hawkins. J. Adolph Griller was the name Laura read on the card. "I do not know such a person. He probably comes from Washington. Send him up." Mr. Griller entered. He was a small man, slovenly in dress, his tone confidential, his manner wholly void of animation, all his features below the forehead protruding, particularly the apple of his throat. Hair without a kink in it, a hand with no grip, a meek hang-dog countenance. He was a falsehood done in flesh and blood, for while every visible sign about him proclaimed him a poor, witless, useless weakling, the truth was that he had the brains to plan great enterprises and the pluck to carry them through. That was his reputation, and it was a deserved one. He softly said, "I called to see you on business, Miss Hawkins. You have my card?" Laura bowed. Mr. Griller continued to purr as softly as before. "I will proceed to business. I am a businessman. I am a lecture agent, Miss Hawkins, and as soon as I saw that you were acquitted, it occurred to me that an early interview would be mutually beneficial." "I don't understand you, sir," said Laura coldly. "No? You see, Miss Hawkins, this is your opportunity. If you will enter the lecture field under good auspices, you will carry everything before you." "But, sir, I never lectured. I haven't any lecture. I don't know anything about it." "Ah, madam, that makes no difference, no real difference. It is not necessary to be able to lecture in order to go into the lecture tour. If one's name is celebrated all over the land, especially, and if she is also beautiful, she is certain to draw large audiences." "But what should I lecture about?" asked Laura, beginning in spite of herself to be a little interested as well as amused. "Oh, why, woman, something about woman, I should say. The marriage relation, a woman's fate, anything of that sort. Call it The Revelations of a Woman's Life. Now, there's a good title. I wouldn't want any better title than that. I'm prepared to make you an offer, Miss Hawkins, a liberal offer. $12,000 for 30 nights. Laura thought. She hesitated. Why not? It would give her employment, money. She must do something. "I will think of it, and let you know soon. But still there is very little likelihood that however, we will not discuss it further now. Remember that the sooner we get to work the better, Miss Hawkins. Public curiosity is so fickle. Good day, madam." The close of the trial released Mr. Henry Brierly and left him free to depart upon his long-talked-of Pacific Coast mission. He was very mysterious about it, even to Philip. "It's confidential, old boy," he said. "A little scheme we have hatched up. I don't mind telling you that it's a good deal bigger thing than that in Missouri, and a sure thing. I wouldn't take $500,000 just for my share, and it will open up something for you, Phil. You will hear from me." Philip did hear from Harry a few months afterward. Everything promised splendidly, but there was a little delay. Could Phil let him have 100, say, for 90 days? Philip himself hastened to Philadelphia, and as soon as the spring opened, to the mine at Ilium, and began transforming the loan he had received from Squire Montague into laborer's wages. He was haunted with many anxieties. In the first place, Ruth was overtaxing her strength in her hospital labors, and Philip felt as if he must move heaven and earth to save her from such toil and suffering. His increased pecuniary obligation oppressed him. It seemed to him, also, that he had been one cause of the misfortune to the Bolton family, and that he was dragging into loss and ruin everybody who associated with him. He worked on day after day and week after week with a feverish anxiety. It would be wicked, thought Philip, and impious, to pray for luck. He felt that perhaps he ought not to ask a blessing upon the sort of labor that was only a venture. But yet in that daily petition, which this very faulty and not very consistent young Christian gentleman put up, he prayed earnestly enough for Ruth and for the Boltons, and for those whom he loved and who trusted in him, and that his life might not be a misfortune to them and a failure to himself. Since this young fellow went out into the world from his New England home, he had done some things that he would rather his mother should not know, things maybe he would shrink from telling Ruth. At a certain green age, young gentlemen are sometimes afraid of being called milksops, and Philip's associates had not always been the most select, such as these historians would have chosen for him, or whom at a later period he would have chosen for himself. It seemed inexplicable, for instance, that his life should have been thrown so much with his college acquaintance, Henry Brierly. Yet this was true of Philip, that in whatever company he had been, he had never been ashamed to stand up for the principles he learned from his mother, and neither raillery nor looks of wonder turned him from that daily habit he learned at his mother's knees. Even flippant Harry respected this, and perhaps it was one of the reasons why Harry and all who knew Philip trusted him implicitly. And yet it must be confessed that Philip did not convey the impression to the world of a very serious young man, or of a man who might not rather easily fall into temptation. One looking for a real hero would have to go elsewhere. The parting between Laura and her mother was exceedingly painful to both. It was as if two friends parted on a wide plain, the one to journey towards the setting, and the other towards the rising sun, each comprehending that every step henceforth must separate their lives wider and wider. End of chapter 58. This is section 59 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 59. When Mr. Noble's bombshell fell in Senator Dilworthy's camp, the statesman was disconcerted for a moment. For a moment, that was all. The next moment he was calmly up and doing. From the center of our country to its circumference, nothing was talked of but Mr. Noble's terrible revelation, and the people were furious. Mind, they were not furious because bribery was uncommon in our public life, but merely because here was another case. Perhaps it did not occur to the nation of good and worthy people that while they continued to sit comfortably at home and leave the true source of our political power, the primaries, in the hands of saloon-keepers, dog-fanciers, and hod-carriers, they could go on expecting another case of this kind, and even dozens and hundreds of them, and never be disappointed. However, they may have thought that to sit at home and grumble would some day right the evil. Yes, the nation was excited, but Senator Dilworthy was calm, what was left of him after the explosion of the shell, calm and up and doing. What did he do first? What would you do first after you had tomahawked your mother at the breakfast table for putting too much sugar in your coffee? You would ask for a suspension of public opinion. That is what Senator Dilworthy did. It is the custom. He got the usual amount of suspension. Far and wide he was called a thief, a briber, a promoter of steamship subsidies, railway swindles, robberies of the government in all possible forms and fashions. Newspapers and everybody else called him a pious hypocrite, a sleek, oily fraud, a reptile who manipulated temperance movements, prayer meetings, Sunday schools, public charities, missionary enterprises, all for his private benefit. And as these charges were backed up by what seemed to be good and sufficient evidence, they were believed with national unanimity. Then Mr. Dilworthy made another move. He moved instantly to Washington and demanded an investigation. Even this could not pass without comment. Many papers used language to this effect: Senator Dilworthy's remains have demanded an investigation. This sounds fine and bold and innocent, but when we reflect that they demand it at the hands of the Senate of the United States, it simply becomes matter for derision. One might as well set the gentlemen detained in the public prisons to trying each other. This investigation is likely to be, like all other senatorial investigations, amusing but not useful. Query: why does the Senate still stick to this pompous word, investigation? One does not blindfold oneself in order to investigate an object. Mr. Dilworthy appeared in his place in the Senate and offered a resolution appointing a committee to investigate his case. It carried, of course, and the committee was appointed. Straightway the newspapers said, "Under the guise of appointing a committee to investigate the late Mr. Dilworthy, the Senate yesterday appointed a committee to investigate his accuser, Mr. Noble." This is the exact spirit and meaning of the resolution, and the committee cannot try anybody but Mr. Noble without overstepping its authority. That Dilworthy had the effrontery to offer such a resolution will surprise no one,
and that the Senate could entertain it without blushing and pass it without shame will surprise no one. We are now reminded of a note which we have received from the notorious burglar Murphy, in which he finds fault with a statement of ours to the effect that he had served one term in the penitentiary and also one in the U.S. Senate. He says, "The latter statement is untrue and does me great injustice." After an unconscious sarcasm like that, further comment is unnecessary. And yet the Senate was roused by the Dilworthy trouble. Many speeches were made. One senator, who was accused in the public prints of selling his chances of re-election to his opponent for $50,000, and had not yet denied the charge, said that the presence in the Capitol of such a creature as this man Noble, to testify against a brother member of their body, was an insult to the Senate. Another senator said, "Let the investigation go on, and let it make an example of this man Noble. Let it teach him and men like him that they could not attack the reputation of a United States senator with impunity." Another said he was glad the investigation was to be had, for it was high time that the Senate should crush some cur like this man Noble, and thus show his kind that it was able and resolved to uphold its ancient dignity. A bystander laughed at this finely delivered peroration, and said, "Why, this is the senator who franked his baggage home through the mails last week. Registered at that. However, perhaps he was merely engaged in upholding the ancient dignity of the Senate, then." "No, the modern dignity of it," said another bystander. "It don't resemble its ancient dignity, but it fits its modern style like a glove." There being no law against making offensive remarks about U.S. senators, this conversation and others like it continued without let or hindrance. But our business is with the investigating committee. Mr. Noble appeared before the committee of the Senate and testified to the following effect. He said that he was a member of the state legislature of the happy land of Canaan, that on the day of he assembled himself together at the city of Saints' Rest, the capital of the state, along with his brother legislators, that he was known to be a political enemy of Mr. Dilworthy and bitterly opposed to his re-election, that Mr. Dilworthy came to Saints' Rest and reported to be buying pledges of votes with money, that the said Dilworthy sent for him to come to his room in the hotel at night, and he went, was introduced to Mr. Dilworthy, called 2 or 3 times afterward at Dilworthy's request, usually after midnight. Mr. Dilworthy urged him to vote for him. Noble declined. Dilworthy argued, said he was bound to be elected and could then ruin him, Noble, if he voted no. Said he had every railway and every public office and stronghold of political power in the state under his thumb, and could set up or pull down any man he chose. Gave instances showing where and how he had used this power. If Noble would vote for him, he would make him a representative in Congress. Noble still declined to vote, and said he did not believe Dilworthy was going to be elected. Dilworthy showed a list of men who would vote for him, a majority of the legislature, gave further proofs of his power by telling Noble everything the opposing party had done or said in secret caucus, claimed that his spies reported everything to him, and that— Here a member of the committee objected that this evidence was irrelevant and also in opposition to the spirit of the committee's instructions, because if these things reflected upon any one, it was upon Mr. Dilworthy. The chairman said, let the person proceed with his statement. The committee could exclude evidence that did not bear upon the case. Mr. Noble continued. He said that his party would cast him out if he voted for Mr. Dilworthy. Dilworthy said that that would inure to his benefit because he would then be a recognized friend of his, Dilworthy's, and he could consistently exalt him politically and make his fortune. Noble said he was poor, and it was hard to tempt him so. Dilworthy said he would fix that. He said, tell me what you want, and say you will vote for me. Noble could not say. Dilworthy said, I will give you $5,000. A committeeman said impatiently that this stuff was all outside the case, and valuable time was being wasted. This was all a plain reflection upon a brother senator. The chairman said it was the quickest way to proceed, and the evidence need have no weight. Mr. Noble continued. He said he told Dilworthy that $5,000 was not much to pay for a man's honor, character, and everything that was worth having. Dilworthy said he was surprised. He considered $5,000 a fortune for some men, asked what Noble's figure was. Noble said he could not think $10,000 too little. Dilworthy said it was a great deal too much. He would not do it for any other man, but he had conceived a liking for Noble, and where he liked a man his heart yearned to help him. He was aware that Noble was poor, and had a family to support, and that he bore an unblemished reputation at home. For such a man and such a man's influence he could do much, and feel that to help such a man would be an act that would have its reward. The struggles of the poor always touched him. He believed that Noble would make a good use of this money, and that it would cheer many a sad heart and needy home. He would give the $10,000. All he desired in return was that when the balloting began, Noble should cast his vote for him, and should explain to the legislature that upon looking into the charges against Mr. Dilworthy of bribery, corruption, and forwarding stealing measures in Congress, he had found them to be base calumnies upon a man whose motives were pure and whose character was stainless. He then took from his pocket $2,000 in bank bills and handed them to Noble, and got another package containing $5,000 out of his trunk and gave to him also. He blank. A committeeman jumped up and said, "At last, Mr. Chairman, this shameless person has arrived at the point. This is sufficient and conclusive. By his own confession he has received a bribe, and did it deliberately." "This is a grave offense, and cannot be passed over in silence, sir. By the terms of our instructions we can now proceed to mete out to him such punishment as is meet for one who has maliciously brought disrespect upon a senator of the United States. We have no need to hear the rest of his evidence." The chairman said it would be better and more regular to proceed with the investigation according to the usual forms. A note would be made of Mr. Noble's admission. Mr. Noble continued. He said that it was now far past midnight, that he took his leave and went straight to certain legislators, told them everything, made them count the money, and also told them of the exposure he would make in joint convention. He made that exposure, as all the world knew. The rest of the $10,000 was to be paid the day after Dilworthy was elected. Senator Dilworthy was now asked to take the stand and tell what he knew about the man Noble. The senator wiped his mouth with his handkerchief, adjusted his white cravat, and said that but for the fact that public morality required an example for the warning of future nobles, he would beg that in Christian charity this poor misguided creature might be forgiven and set free. He said that it was but too evident that this person had approached him in the hope of obtaining a bribe. He had intruded himself time and again, and always with moving stories of his poverty. Mr. Dilworthy said that his heart had bled for him, insomuch that he had several times been on the point of trying to get someone to do something for him. Some instinct had told him from the beginning that this was a bad man, an evil-minded man, but his inexperience of such had blinded him to his real motives, and hence he had never dreamed that his object was to undermine the purity of a United States senator. He regretted that it was plain now that such was the man's object, and that punishment could not with safety to the Senate's honor be withheld. He grieved to say that one of those mysterious dispensations of an inscrutable providence which are decreed from time to time by his wisdom and for his righteous purposes had given this conspirator's tale a color of plausibility, but this would soon disappear under the clear light of truth which would now be thrown upon the case. "It so happened," said the senator, "that about the time in question a poor young friend of mine, living in a distant town of my state, wished to establish a bank. He asked me to lend him the necessary money. I said I had no money just then, but would try to borrow it. The day before the election a friend said to me that my election expenses must be very large, especially my hotel bills, and offered to lend me some money. Remembering my young friend, I said I would like a few thousand now, and a few more by and by, whereupon he gave me 2 packages of bills said to contain $2,000 and $5,000 respectively. I did not open the packages or count the money. I did not give any note or receipt for the same. I made no memorandum of the transaction, and neither did my friend. That night this evil man Noble came troubling me again. I could not rid myself of him, though my time was very precious. He mentioned my young friend and said he was very anxious to have the $7,000 now to begin his banking operations with, and could wait a while for the rest. Noble wished to get the money and take it to him.
I finally gave him the 2 packages of bills. I took no note or receipt from him, and made no memorandum of the matter. I no more look for duplicity and deception in another man than I would look for it in myself. I never thought of this man again until I was overwhelmed the next day by learning what a shameful use he had made of the confidence I had reposed in him and the money I had entrusted to his care. This is all, gentlemen. To the absolute truth of every detail of my statement I solemnly swear, and I call Him to witness who is the truth and the loving Father of all whose lips abhor false speaking. I pledge my honor as a senator that I have spoken but the truth. May God forgive this wicked man as I do. Mr. Noble: Senator Dilworthy, your bank account shows that up to that day, and even on that very day, you conducted all your financial business through the medium of checks instead of bills, and so kept careful record of every money transaction. Why did you deal in bank bills on this particular occasion? The Chairman: The gentleman will please to remember that the committee is conducting this investigation. Mr. Noble: Then will the committee ask the question? The Chairman: The committee will, when it desires to know. Mr. Noble: Which will not be during this century, perhaps. The Chairman: Another remark like that, sir, will procure you the attentions of the Sergeant-at-Arms. Mr. Noble: Damn the Sergeant-at-Arms, and the committee, too. Several committeemen: Mr. Chairman, this is contempt. Mr. Noble: Contempt of whom? Of the committee, of the Senate of the United States. Mr. Noble: Then I am become the acknowledged representative of a nation. You know as well as I do that the whole nation hold as much as 3/5 of the United States Senate in entire contempt. 3/5 of you are Dilworthys. The Sergeant-at-Arms very soon put a quietus upon the observations of the representative of the nation, and convinced him that he was not in the over-free atmosphere of his happy land of Canaan. The statement of Senator Dilworthy naturally carried conviction to the minds of the committee. It was close, logical, unanswerable. It bore many internal evidences of its truth. For instance, it is customary in all countries for business men to loan large sums of money in bank bills instead of checks. It is customary for the lender to make no memorandum of the transaction. It is customary for the borrower to receive the money without making a memorandum of it, or giving a note or a receipt for its use. The borrower is not likely to die or forget about it. It is customary to lend nearly anybody money to start a bank with, especially if you have not the bank to lend him and have to borrow it for the purpose. It is customary to carry large sums of money in bank bills about your person or in your trunk. It is customary to hand a large sum in bank bills to a man you have just been introduced to, if he asks you to do it, to be conveyed to a distant town and delivered to another party. It is not customary to make a memorandum of this transaction. It is not customary for the conveyor to give a note or a receipt for the money. It is not customary to require that he shall get a note or a receipt from the man he is to convey it to in the distant town. It would be at least singular in you to say to the proposed conveyor, "You might be robbed. I will deposit the money in a bank and send a check for it to my friend through the mail." Very well. It being plain that Senator Dilworthy's statement was rigidly true, and this fact being strengthened by his adding to it the support of his honor as a senator, the committee rendered a verdict of not proven that a bribe had been offered and accepted. This, in a manner, exonerated Noble and let him escape. The committee made its report to the Senate, and that body proceeded to consider its acceptance. One senator, indeed several senators, objected that the committee had failed of its duty. They had proved this man Noble guilty of nothing. They had meted out no punishment to him. If the report were accepted, he would go forth free and scatheless, glorying in his crime, and it would be a tacit admission that any blackguard could insult the Senate of the United States and conspire against the sacred reputation of its members with impunity. The Senate owed it to the upholding of its ancient dignity to make an example of this man Noble. He should be crushed. An elderly senator got up and took another view of the case. This was a senator of the worn-out and obsolete pattern, a man still lingering among the cobwebs of the past and behind the spirit of the age. He said that there seemed to be a curious misunderstanding of this case.
gentlemen seemed exceedingly anxious to preserve and maintain the honor and the dignity of the Senate. Was this to be done by trying to obscure adventure for attempting to trap a senator into bribing him? Or would not the truer way be to find out whether the senator was capable of being entrapped into so shameless an act, and then try him? Why, of course. Now the whole idea of the Senate seemed to be to shield the senator and turn inquiry away from him. The true way to uphold the honor of the Senate was to have none but honorable men in its body. If this senator had yielded to temptation and had offered a bribe, he was a soiled man and ought to be instantly expelled. Therefore he wanted the senator tried, and not in the usual namby-pamby way, but in good earnest. He wanted to know the truth of this matter. For himself, he believed that the guilt of Senator Dilworthy was established beyond the shadow of a doubt, and he considered that in trifling with his case and shirking it, the Senate was doing a shameful and cowardly thing, a thing which suggested that in its willingness to sit longer in the company of such a man, it was acknowledging that it was itself of a kind with him, and was therefore not dishonored by his presence. He desired that a rigid examination be made into Senator Dilworthy's case, and that it be continued clear into the approaching extra session if need be. There was no dodging this thing with the lame excuse of want of time. In reply, an honorable senator said that he thought it would be as well to drop the matter and accept the committee's report. He said with some jocularity that the more one agitated this thing, the worse it was for the agitator. He was not able to deny that he believed Senator Dilworthy to be guilty, but what then? Was it such an extraordinary case? For his part, even allowing the senator to be guilty, he did not think his continued presence during the few remaining days of the session would contaminate the Senate to a dreadful degree. This humorous sally was received with smiling admiration, notwithstanding it was not wholly new, having originated with the Massachusetts general in the House a day or two before, upon the occasion of the proposed expulsion of a member for selling his vote for money. The Senate recognized the fact that it could not be contaminated by sitting a few days longer with Senator Dilworthy, and so it accepted the committee's report and dropped the unimportant matter. Mr. Dilworthy occupied his seat to the last hour of the session. He said that his people had reposed a trust in him, and it was not for him to desert them. He would remain at his post till he perished, if need be. His voice was lifted up and his vote cast for the last time in support of an ingenious measure contrived by the general from Massachusetts, whereby the President's salary was proposed to be doubled, and every congressman paid several $1,000s extra for work previously done under an accepted contract, and already paid for once and receipted for. Senator Dilworthy was offered a grand ovation by his friends at home, who said that their affection for him and their confidence in him were in no wise impaired by the persecutions that had pursued him, and that he was still good enough for them. The $7,000 left by Mr. Noble with his state legislature was placed in safe keeping to await the claim of the legitimate owner. Senator Dilworthy made one little effort through his protege, the embryo banker, to recover it, but there being no notes of hand or other memoranda to support the claim, it failed. The moral of which is that when one loans money to start a bank with, one ought to take the party's written acknowledgment of the fact. End of chapter 59.
This is section 60 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 60. For some days Laura had been a free woman once more. During this time she had experienced first 2 or 3 days of triumph, excitement, congratulations, a sort of sunburst of gladness after a long night of gloom and anxiety. Then 2 or 3 days of calming down by degrees, a receding of tides, a quieting of the storm wash to a murmurous surf beat, a diminishing of devastating winds to a refrain that bore the spirit of a truce days given to solitude, rest, self-communion, and the reasoning of herself into a realization of the fact that she was actually done with bolts and bars, prison horrors, and impending death. Then came a day whose hours filed slowly by her, each laden with some remnant, some remaining fragment of the dreadful time so lately ended, a day which, closing at last, left the past a fading shore behind her, and turned her eyes toward the broad sea of the future. So speedily do we put the dead away, and come back to our place in the ranks, to march in the pilgrimage of life again. And now the sun rose once more and ushered in the first day of what Laura comprehended and accepted as a new life. The past had sunk below the horizon and existed no more for her. She was done with it for all time. She was gazing out over the trackless expanses of the future now, with troubled eyes. Life must be begun again, at 28 years of age. And where to begin? The page was blank, and waiting for its first record. So this was indeed a momentous day. Her thoughts drifted back, stage by stage, over her career. As far as the long highway receded over the plain of her life, it was lined with the gilded and pillared splendors of her ambition, all crumbled to ruin and ivy-grown. Every milestone marked a disaster. There was no green spot remaining anywhere in the memory of a hope that had found its fruition. The unresponsive earth had uttered no voice of flowers in testimony that one who was blessed had gone that road. Her life had been a failure, that was plain, she said. No more of that. She would now look the future in the face. She would mark her course upon the chart of life and follow it without swerving, through rocks and shoals, through storm and calm, to a haven of rest and peace, or shipwreck. Let the end be what it might, she would mark her course now, today, and follow it. On her table lay 6 or 7 notes. They were from lovers, from some of the prominent names in the land, men whose devotion had survived even the grisly revealments of her character which the courts had uncurtained, men who knew her now, just as she was, and yet pleaded as for their lives for the dear privilege of calling the murderess wife. As she read these passionate, these worshipping, these supplicating missives, the woman in her nature confessed itself. A strong yearning came upon her to lay her head upon a loyal breast and find rest from the conflict of life, solace for her griefs, the healing of love for her bruised heart. With her forehead resting upon her hand, she sat thinking, while the unheeded moments winged their flight. It was one of those mornings in early spring when nature seems just stirring to a half-consciousness out of a long, exhausting lethargy, when the first faint balmy airs go wandering about, whispering the secret of the coming change, when the abused brown grass, newly relieved of snow, seems considering whether it can be worth the trouble and worry of contriving its green raiment again, only to fight the inevitable fight with the implacable winter, and be vanquished and buried once more, when the sun shines out and a few birds venture forth and lift up a forgotten song, when a strange stillness and suspense pervades the waiting air. It is a time when one's spirit is subdued and sad, one knows not why, when the past seems a storm-swept desolation, life a vanity and a burden, and the future but a way to death. It is a time when one is filled with vague longings, when one dreams of flight to peaceful islands in remote solitudes of the sea, or folds his hands and says, "What is the use of struggling and toiling and worrying any more? Let us give it all up." It was into such a mood as this that Laura had drifted from the musings which the letters of her lovers had called up. Now she lifted her head and noted with surprise how the day had wasted. She thrust the letters aside, rose up, and went and stood at the window. But she was soon thinking again, and was only gazing into vacancy. By and by she turned. Her countenance had cleared. The dreamy look was gone out of her face. All indecision had vanished. The poise of her head and the firm set of her lips told that her resolution was formed. She moved toward the table with all the old dignity in her carriage, and all the old pride in her mien. She took up each letter in its turn, touched a match to it, and watched it slowly consume to ashes. Then she said,
I have landed upon a foreign shore, and burned my ships behind me. These letters were the last thing that held me in sympathy with any remnant or belonging of the old life. Henceforth that life and all that pertains to it are as dead to me and as far removed from me as if I were become a denizen of another world." She said that love was not for her. The time that it could have satisfied her heart was gone by and could not return. The opportunity was lost. Nothing could restore it. She said there could be no love without respect, and she would only despise a man who could content himself with a thing like her. Love, she said, was a woman's first necessity. Love being forfeited, there was but one thing left that could give a passing zest to a wasted life, and that was fame, admiration, the applause of the multitude. And so her resolution was taken. She would turn to that final resort of the disappointed of her sex, the lecture platform. She would array herself in fine attire, she would adorn herself with jewels, and stand in her isolated magnificence before massed audiences, and enchant them with her eloquence, and amaze them with her unapproachable beauty. She would move from city to city like a queen of romance, leaving marveling multitudes behind her and impatient multitudes awaiting her coming. Her life, during 1 hour of each day upon the platform, would be a rapturous intoxication, and when the curtain fell, and the lights were out, and the people gone, to nestle in their homes and forget her, she would find in sleep oblivion of her homelessness, if she could. If not, she would brave out the night in solitude and wait for the next day's hour of ecstasy. So, to take up life and begin again was no great evil. She saw her way. She would be brave and strong. She would make the best of what was left for her among the possibilities. She sent for the lecture agent, and matters were soon arranged. Straightway all the papers were filled with her name, and all the dead walls flamed with it. The papers called down imprecations upon her head. They reviled her without stint. They wondered if all sense of decency was dead in this shameless murderess, this brazen lobbyist, this heartless seducer of the affections of weak and misguided men. They implored the people, for the sake of their pure wives, their sinless daughters, for the sake of decency, for the sake of public morals, to give this wretched creature such a rebuke as should be an all-sufficient evidence to her and to such as her that there was a limit where the flaunting of their foul acts and opinions before the world must stop. Certain of them, with a higher art, and to her a finer cruelty, a sharper torture, uttered no abuse, but always spoke of her in terms of mocking eulogy and ironical admiration. Everybody talked about the new wonder, canvassed the theme of her proposed discourse, and marveled how she would handle it. Laura's few friends wrote to her, or came and talked with her, and pleaded with her to retire while it was yet time, and not attempt to face the gathering storm. But it was fruitless. She was stung to the quick by the comments of the newspapers. Her spirit was roused. Her ambition was towering now. She was more determined than ever. She would show these people what a hunted and persecuted woman could do. The eventful night came. Laura arrived before the great lecture hall in a close carriage, within 5 minutes of the time set for the lecture to begin. When she stepped out of the vehicle, her heart beat fast, and her eyes flashed with exultation. The whole street was packed with people, and she could hardly force her way to the hall. She reached the anteroom, threw off her wraps, and placed herself before the dressing-glass. She turned herself this way and that. Everything was satisfactory. Her attire was perfect. She smoothed her hair, rearranged a jewel here and there, and all the while her heart sang within her, and her face was radiant. She had not been so happy for ages and ages, it seemed to her. Oh, no, she had never been so overwhelmingly grateful and happy in her whole life before. The lecture agent appeared at the door. She waved him away and said, "Do not disturb me. I want no introduction, and do not fear for me. The moment the hands point to 8, I will step upon the platform." He disappeared. She held her watch before her. She was so impatient that the second hand seemed whole tedious minutes dragging its way around the circle. At last the supreme moment came, and with head erect and the bearing of an empress she swept through the door and stood upon the stage. Her eyes fell upon only a vast, brilliant emptiness. There were not 40 people in the house. There were only a handful of coarse men and 10 or 12 still coarser women lolling upon the benches and scattered about singly and in couples. Her pulses stood still. Her limbs quaked. The gladness went out of her face. There was a moment of silence, and then a brutal laugh and an explosion of catcalls and hisses saluted her from the audience. The clamor grew stronger and louder, and insulting speeches were shouted at her. A half-intoxicated man rose up and threw something which missed her, but it bespattered a chair at her side, and this evoked an outburst of laughter and boisterous admiration. She was bewildered. Her strength was forsaking her. She reeled away from the platform, reached the anteroom, and dropped helpless upon a sofa. The lecture agent ran in with a hurried question upon his lips, but she put forth her hands, and with tears raining from her eyes said, "Oh, do not speak! Take me away, please, take me away out of this dreadful place! Oh, this is like all my life, failure, disappointment, misery, always failure! What have I done to be so pursued? Take me away, I beg of you, I implore you!" Upon the pavement she was hustled by the mob, the surging masses roared her name and accompanied it with every species of insulting epithet. They thronged after the carriage, hooting, jeering, cursing, and even assailing the vehicle with missiles. A stone crushed through a blind, wounding Laura's forehead, and so stunning her that she hardly knew what further transpired during her flight. It was long before her faculties were wholly restored, and then she found herself lying on the floor by a sofa in her own sitting-room, and alone. So she supposed she must have sat down upon the sofa and afterward fallen. She raised herself up with difficulty, for the air was chilly and her limbs were stiff. She turned up the gas and sought the glass. She hardly knew herself, so worn and old she looked, and so marred with blood were her features. The night was far spent, and a dead stillness reigned. She sat down by her table, leaned her elbows upon it, and put her face in her hands. Her thoughts wandered back over her old life again, and her tears flowed unrestrained. Her pride was humbled, her spirit was broken. Her memory found but one resting-place. It lingered about her young girlhood with a caressing regret. It dwelt upon it as the one brief interval of her life that bore no curse. She saw herself again in the budding grace of her 12 years, decked in her dainty pride of ribbons, consorting with the bees and the butterflies, believing in fairies, holding confidential converse with the flowers, busying herself all day long with airy trifles that were as weighty to her as the affairs that tax the brains of diplomats and emperors. She was without sin, then, and unacquainted with grief. The world was full of sunshine, and her heart was full of music. From that to this. "If I could only die," she said. "If I could only go back and be as I was then, for 1 hour, and hold my father's hand in mine again, and see all the household about me, as in that old innocent time, and then die. My God, I am humbled, my pride is all gone, my stubborn heart repents. Have pity." When the spring morning dawned, the form still sat there, the elbows resting upon the table and the face upon the hands. All day long the figure sat there, the sunshine enriching its costly raiment and flashing from its jewels. Twilight came, and presently the stars, but still the figure remained. The moon found it there still, and framed the picture with the shadow of the window-sash, and flooded it with mellow light. By and by the darkness swallowed it up, and later the gray dawn revealed it again. The new day grew toward its prime, and still the forlorn presence was undisturbed. But now the keepers of the house had become uneasy. Their periodical knocking still finding no response, they burst open the door. The jury of inquest found that death had resulted from heart disease, and was instant and painless. That was all. Merely heart disease. End of chapter 60. Section 61 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 61. Clay Hawkins, years gone by, had yielded, after many a struggle, to the migratory and speculative instinct of our age and our people, and had wandered further and further westward upon trading ventures. Settling finally in Melbourne, Australia, he ceased to roam, became a steady-going, substantial merchant, and prospered greatly. His life lay beyond the theater of this tale. His remittances had supported the Hawkins family entirely from the time of his father's death until latterly, when Laura, by her efforts in Washington, had been able to assist in this work. Clay was away on a long absence in some of the eastward islands when Laura's troubles began, trying, and almost in vain, to arrange certain interests which had become disordered through a dishonest agent, and consequently he knew nothing of the murder till he returned and read his letters and papers. His natural impulse was to hurry to the States and save his sister if possible, for he loved her with a deep and abiding affection. His business was so crippled now, and so deranged, that to leave it would be ruin. Therefore he sold out at a sacrifice that left him considerably reduced in worldly possessions, and began his voyage to San Francisco. Arrived there, he perceived by the newspapers that the trial was near its close. At Salt Lake, later telegrams told him of the acquittal, and his gratitude was boundless. So boundless, indeed, that sleep was driven from his eyes by the pleasurable excitement almost as effectually as preceding weeks of anxiety had done it. He shaped his course straight for Hawkeye now, and his meeting with his mother and the rest of the household was joyful, albeit he had been away so long that he seemed almost a stranger in his own house. But the greetings and congratulations were hardly finished when all the journals in the land clamored the news of Laura's miserable death. Mrs. Hawkins was prostrated by this last blow, and it was well that Clay was at her side to stay her with comforting words and take upon himself the ordering of the household with its burden of labors and cares. Washington Hawkins had scarcely more than entered upon that decade which carries one of the full blossom of manhood, which we term the beginning of middle age, and yet a brief sojourn at the capital of the nation had made him old. His hair was already turning gray when the late session of Congress began its sittings. It grew grayer still, and rapidly, after the memorable day that saw Laura proclaimed a murderess. It waxed grayer and still grayer during the lagging suspense that succeeded it, and after the crash which ruined his last hope, the failure of his bill in the Senate, and the destruction of its champion Dilworthy. A few days later, when he stood uncovered while the last prayer was pronounced over Laura's grave, his hair was whiter and his face hardly less old than the venerable minister's whose words were sounding in his ears. A week after this, he was sitting in a double-bedded room in a cheap boarding-house in Washington with Colonel Sellers. The two had been living together lately, and this mutual cavern of theirs the Colonel sometimes referred to as their premises, and sometimes as their apartments, more particularly when conversing with persons outside. A canvas-covered modern trunk marked G.W.H. stood on the end by the door, strapped and ready for a journey. On it lay a small morocco satchel, also marked G.W.H. There was another trunk close by, a worn and scarred and ancient hair relic with B.S. wrought in brass nails on its top. On it lay a pair of saddlebags that probably knew more about the last century than they could tell. Washington got up and walked the floor a while in a restless sort of way, and finally was about to sit down on the hair trunk. "Stop! Don't sit down on that!" exclaimed the Colonel. "There, now, that's all right. The chair's better. I couldn't get another trunk like that, not another like it in America, I reckon." "I am afraid not," said Washington, with a faint attempt at a smile. "No, indeed. The man is dead that made that trunk and that saddlebags." "Are his great-grandchildren still living?" said Washington, with levity only in the words, not in the tone. "Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought of that. But anyway, they can't make trunks and saddlebags like that, if they are, and no man can," said the Colonel, with honest simplicity. "Wife didn't like to see me going off with that trunk. She said it was nearly certain to be stolen." "Why?" "Why? Why, aren't trunks always being stolen?" Well, yes, some kinds of trunks are. Very well, then. This is some kind of a trunk, and an almighty rare kind, too. Yes, I believe it is. Well, then, why shouldn't a man want to steal it if he got a chance? Indeed, I don't know. Why should he? Washington, I never heard anybody talk like you. Suppose you were a thief, and that trunk was lying around and nobody watching. Wouldn't you steal it? Come now, answer fair. Wouldn't you steal it? Well, now, since you corner me, I would take it, but I wouldn't consider it stealing. You wouldn't? Well, that beats me. Now, what would you call stealing? Why, taking property is stealing. Property? Now, what a way to talk that is. What do you suppose that trunk is worth? Is it in good repair? Perfect. Hair rubbed off a little, but the main structure is perfectly sound. Does it leak anywhere? Leak? Do you want to carry water in it? What do you mean by does it leak? Why, do the clothes fall out of it when it is stationary? Confound it, Washington, you are trying to make fun of me. I don't know what has got into you today. You act mighty curious. What is the matter with you? Well, I'll tell you, old friend. I am almost happy. I am, indeed. It wasn't Clay's telegram that hurried me up so and got me ready to start with you. It was a letter from Louise. Good. What is it? What does she say? She says, come home. Her father has consented at last. My boy, I want to congratulate you. I want to shake you by the hand. It's a long turn that has no lane at the end of it, as the proverb says, or somehow that way. You'll be happy yet, and Beriah Sellers will be there to see. Thank God. I believe it. General Boswell is pretty nearly a poor man now. The railroad that was going to build up Hawkeye made short work of him, along with the rest. He isn't so opposed to a son-in-law without a fortune now. Without a fortune, indeed. Why, that Tennessee land— Never mind the Tennessee land, Colonel. I am done with that, forever and forever. Why, no, you can't mean to say— My father, away back yonder, years ago, bought it for a blessing for his children. And indeed he did. Si Hawkins said to me— It proved a curse to him as long as he lived, and never a curse like it was inflicted upon any man's heirs. I'm bound to say there's more or less truth. It began to curse me when I was a baby, and it has cursed every hour of my life to this day. Lord, Lord, but it's so. Time and again my wife— I depended on it all through my boyhood, and never tried to do an honest stroke of work for my living. Right again, but then you— I have chased it years and years, as children chase butterflies. We might all have been prosperous now. We might all have been happy, all these heartbreaking years, if we had accepted our poverty at first and gone contentedly to work, and built up our own wealth by our own toil and sweat. It's so, it's so. Bless my soul, how often I've told Si Hawkins, instead of that. We have suffered more than the damned themselves suffer. I loved my father, and I honor his memory and recognize his good intentions, but I grieve for his mistaken ideas of conferring happiness upon his children. I'm going to begin my life over again, and begin it and end it with good solid work. I'll leave my children no Tennessee land. Spoken like a man, sir, spoken like a man. Your hand again, my boy, and always remember that when a word of advice from Beriah Sellers can help, it is at your service. I'm going to begin again, too. Indeed? Yes, sir. I've seen enough to show me where my mistake was. The law is what I was born for. I shall begin the study of the law. Heavens and earth, but that Braham's a wonderful man, sir. Such a head, and such a way with him. But I could see that he was jealous of me. The little licks I got in the course of my argument before the jury— Your argument? Why, you were a witness. Oh, yes, to the popular eye, but I knew when I was dropping information and when I was letting drive at the court with an insidious argument. But the court knew it, bless you, and weakened every time. And Braham knew it. I just reminded him of it in a quiet way, and its final result, and he said in a whisper— You did it, Colonel, you did it, sir, but keep it mum for my sake, and I'll tell you what you do, says he. You go into law, Colonel Sellers, go into the law, sir. That's your native element. And into the law the subscriber is going. There's worlds of money in it. whole worlds of money. Practice first in Hawkeye, then in Jefferson, then in St. Louis, then in New York, in the metropolis of the Western world. Climb and climb and climb, and wind up on the Supreme Bench. Beriah Sellers, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, sir. A made man for all time and eternity. That's the way I block it out, sir, and it's as clear as day, clear as the rosy morn."
Washington had heard little of this. The first reference to Laura's trial had brought the old dejection to his face again, and he stood gazing out of the window at nothing, lost in reverie. There was a knock. The postman handed in a letter. It was from Obedstown, East Tennessee, and was for Washington. He opened it. There was a note saying that enclosed he would please find a bill for the current year's taxes on the 75,000 acres of Tennessee land belonging to the estate of Silas Hawkins, deceased, and added that the money must be paid within 60 days, or the land would be sold at public auction for the taxes as provided by law. The bill was for $180, something more than twice the market value of the land, perhaps. Washington hesitated. Doubts flitted through his mind. The old instinct came upon him to cling to the land just a little longer and give it one more chance. He walked the floor feverishly, his mind tortured by indecision. Presently he stopped, took out his pocketbook, and counted his money. $230. It was all he had in the world. 180 from 230, he said to himself. 50 left. It is enough to get me home. Shall I do it or shall I not? I wish I had somebody to decide for me. The pocketbook lay open in his hand, with Louisa's small letter in view. His eye fell upon that, and it decided him. "It shall go for taxes," he said, "and never tempt me or mine any more." He opened the window and stood there tearing the tax bill to bits and watching the breeze waft them away till all were gone. "The spell is broken. The lifelong curse is ended," he said. "Let us go." The baggage wagon had arrived. 5 minutes later the two friends were mounted upon their luggage in it and rattling off toward the station, the colonel endeavoring to sing "Homeward Bound," a song whose words he knew, but whose tune, as he rendered it, was a trial to auditors. End of chapter 61. This is section 62 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 62. Philip Sterling's circumstances were becoming straitened. The prospect was gloomy. His long siege of unproductive labor was beginning to tell upon his spirits. But what told still more upon them was the undeniable fact that the promise of ultimate success diminished every day now. That is to say, the tunnel had reached a point in the hill which was considerably beyond where the coal vein should pass, according to all his calculations, if there were a coal vein there, and so every foot that the tunnel now progressed seemed to carry it further away from the object of the search. Sometimes he ventured to hope that he had made a mistake in estimating the direction which the vein should naturally take after crossing the valley and entering the hill. Upon such occasions he would go into the nearest mine on the vein he was hunting for, and once more get the bearings of the deposit and mark out its probable course. But the result was the same every time. His tunnel had manifestly pierced beyond the natural point of junction, and then his spirits fell a little lower. His men had already lost faith, and he often overheard them saying it was perfectly plain that there was no coal in the hill. Foremen and laborers from neighboring mines, and no end of experienced loafers from the village, visited the tunnel from time to time, and their verdicts were always the same and always disheartening. "No coal in that hill." Now and then Philip would sit down and think it all over and wonder what the mystery meant. Then he would go into the tunnel and ask the men if there were no signs yet. None. Always none. He would bring out a piece of rock and examine it, and say to himself, "It is limestone. It has crinoids and corals in it. The rock is right." Then he would throw it down with a sigh and say, "But that is nothing. Where coal is,
Limestone with these fossils in it is pretty certain to lie against its foot casing, but it does not necessarily follow that where this peculiar rock is, coal must lie above it or beyond it. This sign is not sufficient. The thought usually followed, there is one infallible sign. If I could only strike that. 3 or 4 times in as many weeks he said to himself, am I a visionary? I must be a visionary. Everybody is in these days. Everybody chases butterflies. Everybody seeks sudden fortune and will not lay one up by slow toil. This is not right. I will discharge the men and go at some honest work. There is no coal here. What a fool I have been. I will give it up. But he never could do it. A half-hour of profound thinking always followed, and at the end of it he was sure to get up and straighten himself and say, there is coal there. I will not give it up, and coal or no coal, I will drive the tunnel clear through the hill. I will not surrender while I am alive. He never thought of asking Mr. Montague for more money. He said there was now but one chance of finding coal against 999, that he would not find it, and so it would be wrong in him to make the request and foolish in Mr. Montague to grant it. He had been working 3 shifts of men. Finally, the settling of a weekly account exhausted his means. He could not afford to run in debt, and therefore he gave the men their discharge. They came into his cabin presently, where he sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands, the picture of discouragement, and their spokesman said, Mr. Sterling, when Tim was down a week with his fall, you kept him on half wages, and it was a mighty help to his family. Whenever any of us was in trouble, you've done what you could to help us out. You've acted fair and square with us every time, and I reckon we are men and know a man when we see him. We haven't got any faith in that hill, but we have a respect for a man that's got the pluck that you've showed. You've fought a good fight with everybody agin you, and if we had grub to go on, I'm damned if we wouldn't stand by you till the cows come home. That is what the boys say. Now, we want to put in one parting blast for luck. We want to work 3 days more, and if we don't find anything, we won't bring in no bill against you. That is what we've come to say. Philip was touched. If he had had money enough to buy 3 days' grub, he would have accepted the generous offer. But as it was, he could not consent to be less magnanimous than the men, and so he declined in a manly speech, shook hands all around, and resumed his solitary communings. The men went back to the tunnel and put in a parting blast for luck anyhow. They did a full day's work, and then they took their leave. They called at his cabin and gave him a good-bye, and were not able to tell him their day's effort had given things a mere promising look. The next day Philip sold all the tools but 2 or 3 sets. He also sold one of the now deserted cabins as old lumber, together with its domestic wares, and made up his mind that he would buy provisions with the trifle of money thus gained, and continue his work alone. About the middle of the afternoon he put on his roughest clothes and went to the tunnel. He lit a candle and groped his way in. Presently he heard the sound of a pick or a drill, and wondered what it meant. A spark of light now appeared in the far end of the tunnel, and when he arrived there he found the man Tim at work. Tim said, I'm to have a job in the Golden Briar mine by and by, in a week or 10 days, and I'm going to work here till then. A man might as well be at something, and besides, I consider that I owe you what you paid me when I was laid up. Philip said no, he didn't owe anything, but Tim persisted, and then Philip said he had a little provision now, and would share. So for several days Philip held the drill, and Tim did the striking. At first Philip was impatient to see the result of every blast, and was always back and peering among the smoke the moment after the explosion. But there was never any encouraging result, and therefore he finally lost almost all interest, and hardly troubled himself to inspect results at all. He simply labored on, stubbornly and with little hope. Tim stayed with him till the last moment, and then took up his job at the Golden Briar, apparently as depressed by the continued barrenness of their mutual labors as Philip was himself. After that Philip fought his battle alone, day after day, and slow work it was. He could scarcely see that he made any progress. Late one afternoon he finished drilling a hole which he had been at work at for more than 2 hours. He swabbed it out, and poured in the powder and inserted the fuse. Then he filled up the rest of the hole with dirt and small fragments of stone, tamped it down firmly, touched his candle to the fuse, and ran. By and by the dull report came, and he was about to walk back mechanically and see what was accomplished. But he halted. Presently turned on his heel and thought rather than said, "No, this is useless, this is absurd. If I found anything, it would only be one of those little aggravating seams of coal, which doesn't mean anything, and—" By this time he was walking out of the tunnel. His thought ran on. "I am conquered. I am out of provisions, out of money. I have got to give it up, all this hard work lost. But I am not conquered. I will go and work for money, and come back and have another fight with fate. Ah me, it may be years, it may be years." Arrived at the mouth of the tunnel, he threw his coat upon the ground, sat down on a stone, and his eye sought the westering sun and dwelt upon the charming landscape which stretched its woody ridges, wave upon wave, to the golden horizon. Something was taking place at his feet which did not attract his attention. His reverie continued, and its burden grew more and more gloomy. Presently he rose up and cast a look far away toward the valley, and his thoughts took a new direction. "There it is. How good it looks! But down there is not up here. Well, I will go home and pack up. There is nothing else to do." He moved off moodily toward his cabin. He had gone some distance before he thought of his coat. Then he was about to turn back, but he smiled at the thought, and continued his journey. Such a coat as that could be of little use in a civilized land. A little further on he remembered that there were some papers of value in one of the pockets of the relic, and then, with a penitent ejaculation, he turned back, picked up the coat, and put it on. He made a dozen steps, and then he stopped very suddenly. He stood still a moment, as one who is trying to believe something and cannot. He put a hand up over his shoulder and felt his back, and a great thrill shot through him. He grasped the skirt of the coat impulsively, and another thrill followed. He snatched the coat from his back, glanced at it, threw it from him, and flew back to the tunnel. He sought the spot where the coat had lain. He had to look close, for the light was waning. Then, to make sure, he put his hand to the ground, and a little stream of water swept against his fingers. "Thank God, I've struck it at last!" He lit a candle and ran into the tunnel. He picked up a piece of rubbish cast out by the last blast, and said, "This clayey stuff is what I've longed for. I know what is behind it." He swung his pick with hearty good will till long after the darkness had gathered upon the earth, and when he trudged home at length, he knew he had a coal vein, and that it was 7 feet thick from wall to wall. He found a yellow envelope lying on his rickety table, and recognized that it was of a family sacred to the transmission of telegrams. He opened it, read it, crushed it in his hand, and threw it down. It simply said, "Ruth is very ill." End of chapter 62. This is section 63 and the epilogue of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 63, read by John Greenman. It was evening when Philip took the cars at the Ilium station. The news of his success had preceded him, and while he waited for the train, he was the center of a group of eager questioners who asked him 100 things about the mine and magnified his good fortune. There was no mistake this time. Philip, in luck, had become suddenly a person of consideration, whose speech was freighted with meaning, whose looks were all significant. The words of the proprietor of a rich coal mine have a golden sound, and his common sayings are repeated as if they were solid wisdom. Philip wished to be alone. His good fortune at this moment seemed an empty mockery, one of those sarcasms of fate, such as that which spreads a dainty banquet for the man who has no appetite. He had longed for success principally for Ruth's sake, and perhaps now, at this very moment of his triumph, she was dying.
"Just what I said, Mr. Satherling.
the landlord of the Ilium Hotel kept repeating. "I told Jake Schmidt he find him there, shush, so sure as nothing." "You ought to have taken a share, Mr. Dusenheimer," said Philip. "Yes, I know. But the old woman, she say, you sticks to your business. So I sticks to 'em, and I makes nothing. That Mr. Brierly, he don't never come back here no more, hain't it?" "Why?" asked Philip. "Well, there is so many peers, and so many other things. I got 'em all set down when he comes back." It was a long night for Philip, and a restless one. At any other time the swing of the cars would have lulled him to sleep, and the rattle and clank of wheels and rails, the roar of the whirling iron, would have only been cheerful reminders of swift and safe travel. Now they were voices of warning and taunting, and instead of going rapidly the train seemed to crawl at a snail's pace. And it not only crawled, but it frequently stopped. And when it stopped it stood dead still, and there was an ominous silence. Was anything the matter, he wondered? Only a station, probably. Perhaps, he thought, a telegraphic station. And then he listened eagerly. Would the conductor open the door and ask for Philip Sterling and hand him a fatal dispatch? How long they seemed to wait! And then, slowly beginning to move, they were off again, shaking, pounding, screaming through the night. He drew his curtain from time to time and looked out. There was the lurid skyline of the wooded range along the base of which they were crawling. There was the Susquehanna gleaming in the moonlight. There was a stretch of level valley with silent farmhouses, the occupants all at rest, without trouble, without anxiety. There was a church, a graveyard, a mill, a village. And now, without pause or fear, the train had mounted a trestle-work high in air and was creeping along the top of it while a swift torrent foamed 100 feet below. What would the morning bring? Even while he was flying to her, her gentle spirit might have gone on another flight, whither he could not follow her. He was full of foreboding. He fell at length into a restless doze. There was a noise in his ears as of a rushing torrent when a stream is swollen by a freshet in the spring. It was like the breaking up of life. He was struggling in the consciousness of coming death, when Ruth stood by his side, clothed in white, with a face like that of an angel, radiant, smiling, pointing to the sky and saying, "Come." He awoke with a cry. The train was roaring through a bridge, and it shot out into daylight. When morning came, the train was industriously toiling along through the fat lands of Lancaster, with its broad farms of corn and wheat, its mean houses of stone, its vast barns and granaries, built as if for storing the riches of Heliogabalus. Then came the smiling fields of Chester, with their English green, and soon the county of Philadelphia itself, and the increasing signs of the approach to a great city. Long trains of coal cars, laden and unladen, stood upon sidings. The tracks of other roads were crossed. The smoke of other locomotives was seen on parallel lines. Factories multiplied, streets appeared, the noise of a busy city began to fill the air, and with a slower and slower clank on the connecting rails and interlacing switches the train rolled into the station and stood still. It was a hot August morning. The broad streets glowed in the sun, and the white-shuttered houses stared at the hot thoroughfares like closed bakers' ovens set along the highway. Philip was oppressed with the heavy air. The sweltering city lay as in a swoon. Taking a streetcar, he rode away to the northern part of the city, the newer portion, formerly the district of Spring Garden, for in this the Boltons now lived, in a small brick house befitting their altered fortunes. He could scarcely restrain his impatience when he came in sight of the house. The window shutters were not bowed, thank God for that. Ruth was still living, then. He ran up the steps and rang. Mrs. Bolton met him at the door. "Thee is very welcome, Philip." "And Ruth?" "She is very ill, but quieter than she has been, and the fever is a little abating. The most dangerous time will be when the fever leaves her. The doctor fears she will not have strength enough to rally from it. Yes, thee can see her." Mrs. Bolton led the way to the little chamber where Ruth lay. "Oh," said her mother, "if she were only in her cool and spacious room in her old home! She says that seems like heaven." Mr. Bolton sat by Ruth's bedside, and he rose and silently pressed Philip's hand. The room had but one window. That was wide open to admit the air, but the air that came in was hot and lifeless. Upon the table stood a vase of flowers. Ruth's eyes were closed. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and she moved her head restlessly as if in pain. "Ruth," said her mother, bending over her, "Philip is here." Ruth's eyes unclosed. There was a gleam of recognition in them. There was an attempt at a smile upon her face, and she tried to raise her thin hand, as Philip touched her forehead with his lips, and he heard her murmur, "Dear Phil." There was nothing to be done but to watch and wait for the cruel fever to burn itself out. Dr. Longstreet told Philip that the fever had undoubtedly been contracted in the hospital, but it was not malignant, and would be little dangerous if Ruth were not so worn down with work, or if she had a less delicate constitution. "It is only her indomitable will that has kept her up for weeks, and if that should leave her now, there will be no hope. You can do more for her now, sir, than I can." "How?" asked Philip eagerly. "Your presence, more than anything else, will inspire her with a desire to live." When the fever turned, Ruth was in a very critical condition. For 2 days her life was like the fluttering of a lighted candle in the wind. Philip was constantly by her side, and she seemed to be conscious of his presence, and to cling to him, as one borne away by a swift stream clings to a stretched-out hand from the shore. If he was absent a moment, her restless eyes sought something they were disappointed not to find. Philip so yearned to bring her back to life, he willed it so strongly and passionately, that his will appeared to affect hers, and she seemed slowly to draw life from his. After 2 days of this struggle with the grasping enemy, it was evident to Dr. Longstreet that Ruth's will was beginning to issue its orders to her body with some force, and that strength was slowly coming back. In another day there was a decided improvement. As Philip sat holding her weak hand and watching the least sign of resolution in her face, Ruth was able to whisper, "I so want to live. For you, Phil." "You will, darling, you must," said Philip, in a tone of faith and courage that carried a thrill of determination, of command, along all her nerves. Slowly Philip drew her back to life. Slowly she came back, as one willing but well-nigh helpless. It was new for Ruth to feel this dependence on another's nature, to consciously draw strength of will from the will of another. It was a new but a dear joy to be lifted up and carried back into the happy world, which was now all aglow with the light of love, to be lifted and carried by the one she loved more than her own life. "Sweetheart," she said to Philip, "I would not have cared to come back but for thy love." "Not for thy profession?" "Oh, thee may be glad enough of that some day, when thy coal bed is dug out and thee and father are in the air again." When Ruth was able to ride, she was taken into the country, for the pure air was necessary to her speedy recovery. The family went with her. Philip could not be spared from her side, and Mr. Bolton had gone up to Ilium to look into that wonderful coal mine and to make arrangements for developing it and bringing its wealth to market. Philip had insisted on reconveying the Ilium property to Mr. Bolton, retaining only the share originally contemplated for himself, and Mr. Bolton, therefore, once more found himself engaged in business and a person of some consequence in Third Street. The mine turned out even better than was at first hoped, and would, if judiciously managed, be a fortune to them all. This also seemed to be the opinion of Mr. Bigler, who heard of it as soon as anybody, and, with the impudence of his class, called upon Mr. Bolton for a little aid in a patent car-wheel he had bought an interest in. That rascal Small, he said, had swindled him out of all he had. Mr. Bolton told him he was very sorry, and recommended him to sue Small. Mr. Small also came with a similar story about Mr. Bigler, and Mr. Bolton had the grace to give him like advice. And he added, "If you and Bigler will procure the indictment of each other, you may have the satisfaction of putting each other in the penitentiary for the forgery of my acceptances." Bigler and Small did not quarrel, however. They both attacked Mr. Bolton behind his back as a swindler, and circulated the story that he had made a fortune by failing. In the pure air of the Highlands, amid the golden glories of ripening September, Ruth rapidly came back to health. How beautiful the world is to an invalid whose senses are all clarified, who has been so near the world of spirits that she is sensitive to the finest influences, and whose frame responds with a thrill to the subtlest ministrations of soothing nature. Mere life is a luxury, and the color of the grass, of the flowers, of the sky, the wind in the trees, the outlines of the horizon, the forms of clouds, all give a pleasure as exquisite as the sweetest music to the ear famishing for it. The world was all new and fresh to Ruth, as if it had just been created for her, and love filled it till her heart was overflowing with happiness. It was golden September also at Fallkill, and Alice sat by the open window in her room at home, looking out upon the meadows where the laborers were cutting the second crop of clover. The fragrance of it floated to her nostrils. Perhaps she did not mind it. She was thinking. She had just been writing to Ruth, and on the table before her was a yellow piece of paper with a faded four-leafed clover pinned on it, only a memory now. In her letter to Ruth she had poured out her heartiest blessings upon them both, with her dear love forever and forever. "Thank God," she said, "they will never know." They never would know, and the world never knows how many women there are like Alice, whose sweet but lonely lives of self-sacrifice, gentle, faithful, loving souls, bless it continually. "She is a dear girl," said Philip, when Ruth showed him the letter. "Yes, Phil, and we can spare a great deal of love for her. Our own lives are so full." End of chapter 63. Appendix. Perhaps some apology to the reader is necessary in view of our failure to find Laura's father. We supposed, from the ease with which lost persons are found in novels, that it would not be difficult. But it was. Indeed, it was impossible. And therefore the portions of the narrative containing the record of the search have been stricken out, not because they were not interesting, for they were, but inasmuch as the man was not found after all, it did not seem wise to harass and excite the reader to no purpose. The Authors. End of Appendix, and end of The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, read by John Greenman.